And I know, yeah, so everyone is accounted for. And we will call to order our study session with our compensation study, and I'll turn it over to Director Ducharme, or Manager Ducharme. I gave you a promotion.
Thank you, Mayor. Good evening, Mayor and members of council. I am happy to welcome Miss Lori Graves, the owner and principal of Graves Consulting, to present our compensation study. I will turn it over to Lori.
Awesome. Thank you. I don't know if this is, oh, it is on. Okay. I was going to say I'm going to have to stand back because I have to pull it pretty far down. I'm a little shorter than most people, but at least your podium, you can see me over it because there's a lot of times that's not the case. So I appreciate each of you making time for me to come to your session this evening. It's been a pleasure working with the city, and we've done a pretty deep dive from a compensation perspective and looked at really not many stones have gone unturned. And so I want to go through tonight a fairly brief presentation that talks about not just the results, but really the intent of the project, the process we went through, the deliverables, and then wrapping up with the recommendations. So it's not very long. There should be plenty of opportunity for discussion and questions. So a little bit about Graves Consulting. We are a human resources consulting firm that specializes in working with the public sector. I would say probably 80% of our clients are public sector clients, and the vast majority of those are here in the state of Colorado. We do have clients in several other kind of surrounding states, but the bulk of the work we do is here. We are a fairly small team, but we stay pretty focused on the work that we know. We don't really try to be all things to all people, and so most of what we do is municipal compensation, and we enjoy it. I used to work more heavily in the private sector, and I much prefer working in the public sector. I enjoy working for people who are working for their communities. There's a real difference. There's a very different culture and a different feel, and I appreciate the transparency that comes with public sector organizations. So Eric Marburger worked on this project with me a little bit. Eric was previously the principal of his own HR consulting firm. He lives just about 2 or 3 miles from here, and then also did some of the pay equity work that we did for the city. And we have a new consultant who'll be onboarding in a few weeks. And if we get the chance to work together again, you might have the opportunity to meet her. So the intent and the scope, obviously the intent of the project, I'm sure this is no surprise to anybody, is to make sure that the city can continue to recruit and retain the talent that you need. And the most important way to do that is to make sure that you're paying competitively to your external market. And it's been no small feat to do that over the last couple of years, right? Because that's been quite the moving target. So it's a really good time to be doing a full in-depth comp study because the labor market has changed significantly, and I'm sure each of you are aware of that. And while the majority of our focus in the project has been on looking at base pay, right, and ensuring that base pay is aligned to market, we also want to make sure that we maintain internal equity within the organization. So making sure that positions that have similar span and scope of responsibility are placed equitably on your pay structure, right? We know that market does not always value every job the same, even though they may have very similar requirements. And so we try to keep an eye on that to make sure that you're going to be competitive externally, you're going to have internal equity, and you're not going to have a situation where you have one department maybe constantly stealing from another, right? Because we don't have the jobs balanced well on the pay structure. We also, and particularly for our smaller clients, we really want to make sure that we allow for career progression as much as is possible, right? So wherever there are positions where we can create multiple levels of a job to help from a retention standpoint as people gain more skill set and experience. Now, we don't want to create arbitrary levels just for the sake of paying people more money, but where you can tell the difference between a 1 or a 2 or a 3, we like to see organizations build that because the most expensive thing you can do is lose your longer service fully trained people, right? Those you don't recuperate those costs very quickly. So that's our primary goals. Our scope within that intent is to gather valid compensation survey data from a defined labor market that we'll talk about, understand how those jobs match to your jobs, and use that information to recommend a pay structure or structures for the city based on all of that data. Now, in addition to the work that we did on base pay, we did do what I would call a high-level benefits comparison. So it's a bit of a look from a total reward standpoint. when we talk about, when I say high level, I mean, we really looked at what we kind of call the big three: the cost of health insurance, the retirement plan contribution percentages, and the paid time off, right? So we'll share that information as well. And then from that, we provide our recommendations for your pay structures. We also include recommendations for implementation and for ongoing maintenance, right? Because it's important that we leave you with a process so that it's not just tied to market right now, but that you have everything you need to make sure that it continues to stay tied to market, and that you have a process in place that employees move through their pay ranges appropriately, right? So a lot of those things we include as well. So our deliverables throughout all of this, really, we start out, particularly with a new client we haven't worked with before, we start out by making sure we fully understand current state, right? We look at your current wage classification structure, what the pay grades and ranges look like. We read the job descriptions. We look at org charts. We met with the leadership team, right? We find out what it is that are pain points for them. Then we meet individually with every department head to make sure that we also understand what those jobs look like here at the city, right? So we know municipal jobs really well, but we also know that everybody has a little bit of uniqueness in the way they organize their jobs, right? Or what they expect, what certifications they require, or how they combine roles, right? And even the best written job description is really no replacement for a conversation with a leader to make sure we really understand what's unique about a job, right? So we do that to make sure we understand it. Then we talk about what is the market that the city should be compared to make sure that you're really getting a good representative view of the labor market you're competing in. And many times we have clients who will say, you know, we constantly trade employees back and forth with these 2 or 3 other municipalities, right? I want to look at those. And my response is, that's great. We can look at those. We need to add more to it, right? If you try to just compare yourself to a couple of data points, you're going to get data that is not statistically valid and can be a little bit all over the board. So we want it to be a broad view of the market. Then we go through, look at the existing wage survey data that we have, and we'll talk about our data sources for that. From that information, once we understand the jobs, we pull information from the surveys. We use that to recommend pay structures. And then we also use it to recommend placement on those pay structures for each of the positions to make sure that, again, they're aligning to that market value. Once we have that in a place where we feel like it's appropriate, we do a financial impact analysis. We talk about ways and different phased-in approaches for implementation. Again, we look at internal equity. We look at things like pay compression, right, which has always been an issue in compensation, but never more so than the last couple of years, because as those rates continue to rise for those entry-level workers, they're putting pressure on all of the other workers that have more experience. And so we really want to make sure you don't end up with pay compression that causes some of your longer service people to leave, right? Because that's your most expensive turnover. And then again, we did a high-level benefit comparison to make sure that you really are well-rounded all the way around when it comes to compensation. So defined market. We proposed a defined market for the city that was, we believe, broad and reflective of the larger Denver-Boulder area, which is the labor market you're competing in, right? You're not just competing with some of the organizations that are maybe here on the south side. People have a lot of mobility, right, and ability to live in different areas. And you know, in public sector, it used to be, or in some areas, I should say it still is, it's a little bit harder because the communities are a little further apart. But in this area, there's 30 different municipalities that somebody could work for, many times living in the same home, right? So you've got to make sure you're competitive with that larger set. And our goal, again, is to create a large enough data set that the data we get for each job is statistically valid, right? We don't want 3 or 4 data points. We want more than that. When we pull that data, we do include special districts for jobs where that's applicable, and we also include private sector, right? Because we know that you have positions here at the city that same work is done in the private sector, so you're not just competing with other public sector organizations for your talent. This is the list of the organizations in this area that we pulled data from. We use Employers Council and Colorado Municipal League. I'm sure you're familiar with both member-based organizations that have large representation of public sector, and Employers Council also gathers private sector, and they produce data based on surveys that they send every year where they provide all of the actual wage information for their employees for the jobs that we're matching. So again, you can see it's a pretty broad brush. Now, when you look at that, you'll notice there are several communities on there that are larger. Some may be significantly larger than you are. And that makes the jobs sometimes a little bit different, right? So I want to talk a little bit about our philosophy about that. When we look at entry-level to mid-level jobs, right? So for instance, a parks maintenance worker, right? Or a utility billing specialist. The work that they're doing in a city like yours is really very similar to what they'd be doing in Fort Collins, right? Or Thornton or some of the larger areas. The difference is there's many more of them there. But the work is essentially the same, right? Now that changes when you start getting into management level positions, managers, directors, department heads, right? There is a pretty significant difference between a public works director that has 10 people in their downline and one that has 150, right? We know that's a bigger, broader scope. So at those higher level jobs, we tend to adjust a little bit for size of community, but we don't do that at the more entry or mid-level jobs because it's really not that big of a difference, right? So I think that kind of helps put in perspective how we blend data from so many different sizes of organizations. So again, when we're pulling information from those surveys, what we're pulling are actual wages being paid to other employees in those organizations doing similar work, meaning we're not just looking at their pay ranges, comparing them to yours and saying, oh, okay, they're close enough, right? Or shift a little bit. We want to know what are people actually making. Because we have some clients who almost all of their employees are in the bottom of their pay ranges. We have some who they're very much at the top, just depending on how they administer the pay system. We want to base what we're making our recommendations on actual wages. So that's what we're pulling. And then we scrub those results to make sure the data is valid for you, for the uniqueness that we learn about when we talk about your positions, right? Do we need to make adjustments for the ways in which some of your jobs might differ from what that job looks like externally? We match as many positions as we can using those data sources, and then we age that data forward to reflect the fact that we're working on pay structure recommendations that would go into effect for you in 2024. And the survey data is sometimes 9 months old, sometimes it's a year and a half old, right? Depending on how long since people gathered the data, they scrubbed it, they published it, and now we're using it. So we age that data forward to make sure that we don't build something that's already out of date when you implement it. Based on all of that, when we're recommending new pay structures, one of the things we really look at is to make sure that the structures we're building you are not only well aligned to market, but that structurally they make sense so that you can build pay processes and practices around them. Meaning, one of the things that's really important is how wide a pay range is, right? So if you think about a pay range, a minimum, a midpoint, a maximum, if you make a pay range wider, you both lower the minimum and you raise the maximum. And if you have, say, entry-level jobs that are placed in a pay grade that's really wide, what you're going to end up with is rates at the bottom that really have no utility to you, right? You can't hire anybody that low. And you're probably also going to have some rates at the top that are a little unrealistic for that type of work. So when we build a pay structure, and you'll see this in here, we tend to build it a little narrower in the lower pay grades and a little wider as you move up into the higher level, more experienced roles, right? So we do that intentionally. We want to make sure all the positions are placed in a pay grade, that it makes sense, that matches the market value. We also want to look at, once we've done that and we've pulled over what are people currently making, that's when we look for pay equity issues, we look for pay compression issues and make adjustments for that. And then we also want to make sure that the structure we build for you is flexible enough that it'll work for you and grow with you as things grow and change, right? You will have jobs that you add, you will have jobs that you change, market values will shift. We want to build a structure that you can easily adapt, right? And make sure that you can keep it current going forward. So currently what the city has is 2 separate pay structures. One for what we call general government, which basically means all of the positions outside of sworn law enforcement, right? And then you have a separate step plan for sworn non-exempt police positions. Very common. That is what we see in the vast majority of our municipal clients, right, that are your size or even larger. On your general government pay structure, it's not necessarily a set pay structure. There are pay grades, minimums and maximums attached to each job, but it's not built into a structure where it has the same widths or the same distance between grades, which is generally where most organizations start out and spend a lot of time, right? You just build the grades you need based on the jobs you have. But over time, when it becomes important and you need to upgrade a job, right, because it's grown in the market faster than others, you want to know there's a consistent distance to get to that next pay grade, right? Because that's going to help you build your pay policies around it, right? It could be that, okay, if this job needs to go up, it only takes 10% to get to the next grade. Well, this one might need to go up, but it takes 18% to get to the next grade. That's what we're trying to avoid, right? We want that structure. On your existing police step plan, it's pretty common that we see them structured this way. Right now, you have officer and sergeant on that, which is what we would recommend. There's currently 9 steps for officer, 5 steps for sergeant. You know, understanding that the general government plan is what we call open range, meaning there's a minimum and a maximum, but employee pay might fall anywhere between there. On a step plan, it's predefined. There's still a minimum and a maximum, but each step is predefined. So the amount of each pay increase, they know what's coming, right? Very common in public safety, right, in both police and fire. Right now, the plan you have, those from about 3 to about 5% apart. So what we're recommending is pretty similar in that it's still sorry, go ahead.
Can I ask a question on that?
Of course.
They put that police chart in what they sent us. The 29, 75, 35, 51, 15, is that the hourly rate, or what is that number?
Yes, I'd need to look at it to make sure. Let's see. Is this what you're looking at?
Yeah.
Yeah, those are hourly rates.
Okay,
Yes,
thank you.
Sorry, I probably should have been clear on that. The annualized sits right above it. There's an annualized number right above it. Okay, let's scroll back to where we were. Okay, so our recommendation is that you keep 2 separate pay structures. We do think it's important for public safety, particularly for police, to be on a separate pay structure from general government, mostly because we know that labor market moves differently, right, than the rest of it. And so you need to be able to have them separate so that you can make adjustments that keep each of those types of positions tied to market. And we also know that they are typically formatted differently. Open range is traditionally what we see for general government, right? The min and the max with pay anywhere between, and step plans are overwhelmingly what we see in public safety. So we think it makes sense to keep those separate. On your general government structure, what we're recommending, I'm sorry, did you have a question?
Yeah, just so I can kind of get this clear in my mind, I'm not as familiar with this step type program as opposed to salary ranges. What causes the progression from step 1 to step 2 to step 3 and so on?
Yeah. It's a great question. So typically it is a combination of time and performance. So you may want to add to that. A step is usually a year, but you only get that step increase assuming you meet all of your performance and training requirements as well. So it's a combination of time and performance. So assuming somebody performs appropriately, they would reach top of the range when they've hit that top step.
Okay.
That makes sense.
Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. So if we go back and talk about the general government pay structure, right, the one that the majority of the city employees would be on, what we're recommending is a pay structure that has 19 pay grades. That doesn't mean that every pay grade has a job assigned to it. It might not, but again, we want to make sure that we have a structure that is consistent. So we build the structure to make sure it's consistent, then we place the positions on it based on their market value, right? As opposed to saying, here's the market value of all the jobs, let's try to build a structure around it. Right? So we built that structure. We have them varying from 35% wide at the bottom, so your more entry-level jobs have a narrower range, which keeps that hiring rate up into a reasonable place, but it also keeps that maximum somewhat reasonable as well for entry-level jobs. They get wider and expand up to 50% wide as you get into the highest level, like department head jobs, right? Those are generally jobs that people are in for a long time, that it takes a lot longer to become fully proficient, so we expect to see a wider pay range. We also built them so that each pay range and grade, and you'll see it on the chart when we show it, is 10% apart from the others. So every time you move up a grade, that midpoint is 10% higher than the one below, and 10% and 10%. Again, that's that common distance that we talked about that is really important when it comes to time to promote someone, time to upgrade a position because it's moved in the market. You want to be able to have that consistent structure, right? So that's what we're recommending. For the police step plan, again, we are recommending that you keep a step plan. All we're doing is making it a little bit narrower. In other words, fewer steps. On average, when you look at the Denver Boulder area, I believe it was about 29 different law enforcement organizations we surveyed a little over a year ago. An average number of steps for a police officer is 6. Now that varies. It doesn't mean everybody has 6, right? Some people have as few as 3 or 4. Some still have 10, 11, 12, but 6 is the average. 9 was a little bit high. I didn't want to make too dramatic of a shift and pull it all the way back. 7 felt like the right amount, and we were able to put that in around the market values in a way that made sense, right? And 7 steps for officer, 5 steps for sergeant. Similar to what you have right now. Few more steps in the officer range, a little bit less in the sergeant range. Each of those steps in that grade are 5 to 6% apart. So before it was 3 to 5%, these steps are worth a little bit more, right? They're going to move through a little bit more aggressively. And we call it front-loaded for officer. And all front-loaded means is that when you look at those steps laid out, when you're in your early years, your first 2 or 3 steps are a little bit higher percent increases than your last few steps in the range. So our goal is to get the officers in and get them up to a reasonable market value so that you can really retain. And as their earnings get a little higher, the increases continue, but they're not quite as big, right? So we front load it to try to really make sure you can get people in and get them up to a market rate that they're not vulnerable, right, to being plucked by other organizations, because obviously that's a lot of what's happening, right? In law enforcement these days, it's primarily laterals, I would guess, that you're hiring because there's fewer and fewer people going through academy, unfortunately. So with that description, this is just a visual. Go ahead.
Question here. I mean, you have cadet, officer, and sergeant, but we have a couple levels above that, don't we? We have commander and we have chief.
Yep. Yeah, it's a great point, and I should have mentioned that. So when we build a step plan for public safety, we build it for just the non-exempt positions. So generally, your exempt leadership level positions, commander-in-chief, sit on the same structure as your other leadership positions. So those positions are placed on this pay structure that we're looking at, the open range. So step plans for officer and sergeant, then it moves to an open range plan for your leadership roles. And that's traditionally what we see.
That's interesting, which I didn't know. So our officers and our sergeants are non-exempt.
Yes.
That actually surprises me.
Yeah, across the board, that's really
Yeah, I mean,
a
that
requirement.
for some reason, that just really, because I don't think of our officers and sergeants just doing routine type, they're not, I mean, that really surprises me.
Yeah, I think it is less a reflection of the skill set of the job and more of the nature of the hours that they work, right? That it would be a little bit unfair or inappropriate to make them exempt and allow them to receive overtime when they might be working some hours that would be beyond a normal work schedule, right? So I think it's intended to be a benefit, and in that view, in my mind, it's appropriate. It's not really a reflection of how responsible the job is. Yeah. So again, on the general government structure, this is just the visualization of what we talked about, right? You can see the pay grades and ranges. They're numbered down the side. The grade numbers I just chose. You can number them however, whatever is most appropriate for you. The only thing I have learned is not to start with grade 1 because nobody likes being in grade 1. So I start with 10 or 100 or 200 just because it's, got to sell your customer the way they want to be sold. You can see, right, I talked about with those midpoint distances, so that statistic on the chart that's all the way over to the right distance, that's just showing the distance between the midpoint of every range. They're equidistant apart from each other, and then you can see the width, measuring min to max. We have the rates in there hourly and also annualized. They're annualized on 2,080, even though I know you probably have some positions that work alternate shifts that may not always work 2,080, but that's just for reference. Okay, so these are open range, which means, again, employees' pay might be anywhere within that pay range that's been assigned to the job that they're in, based on their experience, their tenure, their performance, right? A variety of things. This is what the step plan looks like that we've talked about a couple of times. We include a cadet rate just because should you find yourself in a situation, and I don't know if you do on a regular basis, right? But hire people and put them through academy, you're generally going to have a fixed rate. So we don't build a range around that number because they're going to be in there for a defined period of time, and they're going to stay at that rate for that defined period of time. Once they're out, they'd move into the entry level of police officer and begin to work their way up that structure, right? And on the step plans, the reason we have the steps titled the way we do, where we have entry and then step 1 through 6 instead of numbering them 1 through 7, we do that because when an officer comes in brand new, right, out of academy, brand new, they go into the entry rate. When they have completed a year of service, right, satisfactorily, they'd move to step 1. If we called the entry rate step 1, it'd be 1 year equals step 2, 2 years equals step 3. It just gets a little more confusing. So we number them this way because it's easier from an administrative standpoint, right? But in a plan like this, the idea is you would be at the top of if you're a police officer, you'd work your way to the top of the range in 6 years, right? Now that doesn't mean that your pay increases are over, right, for the rest of your time here. What it means is that you won't receive any more step increases, but every year, or at least every other year, the organization needs to shift the entire structure to continue to keep pace with market, right? So there's this idea of market increases that apply to your pay structure, and then what I usually call merit pay increases, right, that actually affect employees' pay and move them through the pay ranges. So officers would move up very quickly through the steps, and then they'd move much slower once they're at the top. Again, very, very traditional. The big difference here is that in an open range, like general government structure, what we were showing before, usually it's about 15, 18 years to get bottom to top, right? So it's a much longer path in a general government job than it is in public safety. And that's just really a function of the competitive nature of that work. Right? Then you can see sergeant is on there as well. Any questions on those structures before we move on? Nope. Okay. So we'll talk about the high-level impact of implementing this. After we set the structure, placed all the jobs on it, we ran an analysis, and the good news is there was only 4 current city employees who have current pay rates that are below the minimum of the new range that we've put their job in. It means the city has obviously been doing a good job, right, of seeing what's happening in the market and adjusting pay. Even though you haven't done a full-blown comp study, you have been keeping pace, right, with market pretty well, obviously, or you wouldn't have employees to be doing a comp study for, right? So I feel like that's good news. And then there were a handful of other employees that just from looking at hire dates, they're within their range, but they're probably a little lower than their tenure or experience would suggest that they should be, right? So we make recommendations that you not just bring people into the range, but that you move people through the range again so that you're not creating more pay compression, right? By bringing in new people and not moving the existing people through the pay ranges. So we identified that. In addition to bringing everyone to the range minimum, we are also recommending a merit increase pool for 2024 of about 6%. Right? Meaning 6% average pay increases across the population. If you have a performance-based pay system where pay increases vary based on performance ratings, that would be the average, meaning some people might get 4, some people might get as much as 7 or 8. It would roll to 6. Now, that doesn't mean that's the dollar amount that gets approved. That's our recommendation, simply based on what we're seeing in the market and what we're seeing as far as where your current employees are placed in their pay ranges.
So help me with that again, because I've talked with the city manager about this, and I get confused, and I get on board, and then I get confused again. I thought the steps, when you move from a step, that's the merit. And now you're saying, well, no, we recommend you get everybody kind of where they belong. And then you're saying, and a 6% merit. So I don't understand that.
It's a great point, and I should have differentiated. When you're talking about a step plan, merit is already built into that plan. So you're right. That step is their merit pay increase. We are not talking about 6% to the police non-exempt that are on the step plan. They would be moved on to that new step plan, onto whatever step is appropriate based on how many years of experience they have. So that's going to be a different calculation for each person. It's the general government employees that we're recommending a 6% merit. So basically what we're saying is, here's your job. Here's the pay range we've placed your job in. Now, where does your pay fall within that range? We are saying on average across the board, your general government employees should receive roughly a 6% pay increase that would move them further through their pay ranges than they currently are. Again, making room at the bottom to be able to hire in new people with less experience below them. So the 6% is a merit increase, a step plan. The merit increases are built in. Each step is its own merit increase.
But I thought, so maybe I'm confusing. I thought we were going to a step plan in our general.
No, I'm sorry. This screen this is the open range plan that will be for general government. It has a min, a mid, and a max.
The proposal is that we keep the two
Okay.
different plans that we have.
All right.
Sorry. Yeah.
When you use the term merit, I want to make sure I know what's in there and what's not in there. Is cost of living adjustment,
Right.
when you use the term merit, is that outside or inside?
It's generally outside. So you'll hear me talk about two different types of pay increases. Market is the one that would normally encompass what we a lot of times used to call cost of living, right? I tend to not like to call that cost of living. I tend to call it cost of labor. Because if you think about it, if you were really giving cost of living pay increases, you would have been giving 15, 20%, right, for the last couple of years. Cost of living generally outpaces cost of labor. But it's been it's common nomenclature, right, to call it cost of living. And in your scenario, I call that a market increase. Now, if we were taking your existing pay structure and instead of redesigning it, we were just shifting it, the shift to that structure would be the market increase. Market impacts the structure. The merit increase is the employee's pay increase that actually changes their pay number and moves them through their pay range. So that's the terminology that I use. Market adjusts the structure. Merit adjusts the actual person's pay. In a step plan, they're combined because each step represents a merit increase.
So the market adjustment would be to look at this slide and adjust all these numbers accordingly. And it has nothing to do with
Pay.
any individual or any individual job. The whole thing moves up.
So in 2025, these numbers would all increase.
That's exactly it. That's
right.
what I would say. If we were not redesigning, I would be saying, here's the percent I think in market, you should adjust your structure, and here's what you should do with pay. And in the future, that's what we'll do. But we redesigned the underlying structure so we know it's tied to market. It doesn't need a market increase because we've done that, right? Now we're just talking about merit to move employee pay.
So go forward to the slide that you had. Keep going. This one.
Yep.
So in that last bullet, you say 70,000 to bring government employees to appropriate place in range.
Yeah.
But that doesn't include the merit increase.
Right.
I don't understand that.
Yeah, I probably could have used different words. What that 70,000 is, remember there were 4 people who were below the range minimum. So part of that money is the cost of just bringing those people to range minimum. But then you look at those people and a handful of other people who are sitting at range minimum, but they've been doing that job for 4 or 5 years. So we know even without any kind of a merit increase, to just get them to the right place, they need to have a pay increase and be a little further into the range.
Okay. And what is the merit increase based on?
The 6%, it's based on 2 factors, really. What I see all of the other municipal organizations doing in that Denver Boulder labor market, what they're projecting for their budgeted pay increases for next year, and my view of where employees are in their pay ranges compared to their years of experience, right? So if your employees were all sitting pretty high, midpoint or higher in the pay ranges, I might be recommending 3%, 4%. You've got a lot of employees that are low in the pay ranges. They need to move through a little bit more for their pay to really be market-based, right? Our goal is for your structure to be tied to market, but we also want your employees' pay to be representative of what's a market rate based on the amount of experience that they have.
Yeah, I'm not understanding the distinction between that and saying these people are not where they need to be in the pay range, and so we're moving. I mean, I don't, it's Apple, I don't think it's all dollars, so I'm not sure it matters, but, yeah, I'm not understanding. what you-
Really, I think all we're really saying is that there are a handful of people who will move a little bit more than others. So the 6% is going to apply to everybody, but there are a handful of people who were significantly low in their range, and embedded in that 70,000 is moving them up a little bit more, so that then the 6% puts them in a pretty good relative position to everyone else. Does that make sense? You know, in other words, we might have seen somebody, and I'm not looking at the numbers right here, that had 15 years of experience that was only 5% up from the bottom of the range, right? That they would not
Okay,
be in the
and
right.
so is that person getting moved up in the 70,000 or in the meriting?
In the 70,000.
Okay.
So there was, and I want to remember there was 3 or 4 people in that category. I think 4 that were below range minimum and 3 that we were making adjustments to move them into the range. So it's not a significant number of people, but it's the ones that were dramatically off.
So is it 6% across the range? Everybody gets 6%, or is it, some people get more than that, some people will get less than that, and it's an average?
The 6% in my recommendation would be the pool of dollars that you would have to work with for all of your general government employees. So you could do it a variety of ways. You could say, you know what, everybody gets 6, or you could say, hey, my top performers get 8, and my low performers get 4, but I'm averaging 6.
Okay, thank
And
you.
I think, Jim, did you have something you wanted to add?
I
So,
was just going to say the exact same thing, so.
so essentially, just to kind of, the way, what I'm hearing you say is then, and if we follow that and do that, but we need to do about 165,000 to get into the ranges, and then we'll probably be about another 250,000 on top of that.
Whatever the value is of
And that's-
6%
I
of
mean,
your
our
general
salaries
government
are like
payroll.
4 point,
No, that's not exactly correct, because you got to keep in mind, first of all, the police department will already be in their ranges and,
Yeah.
and they won't be adjusted after this. The only people we're talking for merit increases,
are the, okay,
Yep.
yep, that's good, yep.
Yeah.
That's good.
usually, I'm going to say 1% is about 25 to 30,000.
about
So
180.
that gives you about 150,000 for 6.
Cool. Anything else on that? I know this is like kind of the meat of it, so.
Can I, excuse me, jump back to, I wanted to listen to all this to put it in my mind how it all works together, but I want to go back to the question at the beginning, and that is when you talked about the different cities and how we compared. And I want to ask you a bunch of questions, sort of foundational, so that I can understand, because it still seems to me like while we may be losing or gaining employees from the cities that you mentioned, the reality is that we still are not like some of the ones that you listed there. And, where are we more like an Avon, a Vail, an Aspen, from sheer numbers and the types of work and the economic structure and all of those things, so that those numbers should at least be considered to where we sit amongst our peers. What I think I might have heard you say is you want to be competitive within all these ones that we listed because you want to be able to not keep losing your people to the marketplace. But I guess my question that I have is there for lack of a better term, a reputational bump that is worth some money for working in Cherry Hills Village that, while our police guys and women prepare for the worst day, the reality is that in Denver, there's many more shootings per day than there are in Cherry Hills.
Right.
Hopefully, it's a less dangerous job to be a police officer in Cherry Hills than it is in some of these other places.
Right.
Correspondingly, I think at least in the police, maybe that translates into we've got a little bit of a bit more leverage in hiring people because hopefully it's a safer place to work.
Sure. Yeah.
And similarly on our non-police side, while the person who is a parks person is doing the same thing, the reality is they don't have to work in the time pressures of keeping 40 parks nice, they have to do it with 10 parks. And so again, there's a reputational side that maybe we can be comfortably a little bit lower than market. And I'm ready for all the arrows
Yeah.
that, everybody on staff is going to say, I work just as hard. But, we don't have economic blight. We don't have trash. We don't have a lot of programs. Then when we all went to the CML conference and we heard what some of our other cities are working on, we just were like, my goodness, it's good to be in Cherry Hills. But, I guess, are our numbers, do we have to be at or near market? Or can we comfortably say, we don't want to be grossly out of market, but maybe a little under because we're a little under in some of the good ways?
Right. Sure. So I think it's a really valid point, and I think it's something worth talking about. So the underlying question of can you is absolutely. That is 100% an internal decision, right? How you want to position yourself to the market is completely an internal decision. And there absolutely are intangibles beyond, right, cash pay and benefits that bring people in, that keep people here, that create competitive advantage for you. Those things are all wonderful. My guess is that is probably why you have been able to retain as many people as you have, having not done significant compensation restructuring and big pay increases in a while, because you've had a lot of intangibles. A lot of organizations that I work with have been in that place and have enjoyed it for many years. Resort communities, right? I work with a lot of resort communities, and it's a fabulous place to be, and people will take a little bit of a haircut. But in the inflationary time we've seen in the last 2 years, with the cost of living increasing so dramatically, it is getting a lot harder for people to decide to make those decisions based on the non-cash, right, intangibles. They may love working here, but they've got to pay rent and buy groceries and gas in their truck, and they can't do that with a beautiful place to work, right? So it's become a little bit harder, right?
And I think, and that's, because the word intangible is the word I was thinking when Rob was talking, and then you used it. But who knows what that means, and who knows how that operates? You see things, I mean, you consult with all kinds of municipalities. What I don't know is, like you say, hey, cities make their determination on their own. What do you see at the end of the day? What do you see with regard to intangibles? Do they factor it in? I mean, is it all over the board? Is it, what is it? That actually is information that actually would be really, really interesting.
It's a good
Well, and I think that same information is we probably already know this, but are we losing police officers because of pay? I mean, that's the gas in the truck. Or is our administrative and civil side staff moving because they're bigger jobs with bigger responsibilities and more professional satisfaction? Because I would bet dollars to donuts that if you took an equal job and an equal job, people want to be here, I would hope.
Can I ask a process question, because we've got 15 minutes? Have we been through the whole presentation, or is there still more to come?
We're going to talk about the benefit comparison, and that's about it. So we're almost there.
Okay, I'm going to suggest we finish and then kind of go a little more into strategic discussion like that, if that doesn't offend anybody.
I think we can wrap that. We can definitely do that. But hold that thought, because I do think that's something important to talk about and to think about and kind of be of one mind with as a council. It's an important thing to decide on, right, when it comes to how you position yourself. Okay, so benefit comparison. We've talked to this point primarily about cash compensation, about base pay, but we know that benefits is a huge piece of what people come to work for, right? And so it's important that those things be competitive. Employers Council does a good job of gathering all of this data from across their municipal book of business, and that's what we use to compare to. And again, we're not doing we're not looking at the deductible, right, and the co-insurance and the different plans that you offer. What we're saying is big picture, what matters to people is how much comes out of my check every month, right, for health insurance, how much in retirement plan contributions does the city make on my behalf, and what does my paid time off look like, right? So those are what we call the big three. So that's what we looked at. Your health plan costs, absolutely competitive. What you see on there, what you guys offer is plans that range from $0 per month up to $231 per month, depending on plan and number of people covered. The averages out there go from 54 to over 400, right? You're in great shape on what you're charging for health insurance. Retirement plan contributions, they're also competitive, right? You've got a couple of different plans. On the general government side, people can range from 5 to 10% depending on what they contribute to get matching contributions. The average sits at about 5%. So you guys give people the opportunity to earn more, right, if they contribute their own dollars. On the sworn police side, you're basically right at what we see for retirement plan contributions. It averages about 11%, and that's where you are between the two plans, right? So those are competitive. Your paid time off, talking specifically about vacation and sick accruals, competitive as well. Slight differences based on numbers of years, but nothing significant, right? Nothing I would be concerned about. Holidays, the only thing we see is that on average, most of the organizations are recognizing 11 holidays, and you're sitting at 10. So there's potentially another holiday that you could add to that, right? Nothing major here, nothing, no big headline here, no big dollars going in here. Okay. And then implementation. With council approval, the idea is that the pay adjustments that we've just talked about would be effective January 1st. Employees would see that increase on their first check next year. I think that's what we have.
All right, so Rob, back to your and Earl's discussion.
Maybe I can chime in a little bit as well on this. You know, I've had the fortune of working for several cities over my career, some of the most prestigious cities in the country even. And I think there's a fallacy about having the privilege to work for a city because what will happen is it doesn't really matter the city. People's paychecks tend to be what drive their motivation to want to stay. Yes, the scenery is nice. Maybe the issues aren't quite as contentious as some other cities, but at the same time, most of the cities I've worked in actually paid higher than the market because they want to keep and retain those good employees instead of having constant turnover in which it actually costs you more money when you pay below the market. So that would be my thought on that issue.
And I agree with that in terms of the, what was the word you used, the privilege or what was it? That was, I don't agree. But what I do think back is with regard to what the working conditions are like. And, you know, that's the private sector and the private sector. I mean, many private sector companies are known as boiler factories, I mean, and versus, et cetera. And I think, for instance, this, and I was on council when that old city hall was there. And we built that for our residents, et cetera. But I pushed, and I was one of the main movers pushing so hard for that. It was for our employees. Because I thought it was an S-hole, to be honest with you. And to be honest with you, I'm amazed that we kept our employees as well as we did working over there, as opposed to this. And again, you're not talking extremes here at the end of the day, but the point is that I would sit back and go, okay, if the pay remains equal and you're working in something like that versus working in something like here, that makes a difference.
Agreed.
I mean, it needs to make a difference. I mean, and that's an important
pay
thing.
equal is the key phrase.
Well, yeah, but you know, it's you're always looking at the end of the day, your working conditions. You know, the type of people that you're working for, the how they're valued. You know, not reputation, but the like I say, the esprit de corps, whatever word you want to look for at the end of the day. Those things matter. Now, they oftentimes don't matter until you get to a certain level where, and that's the thing, is you got to get to that where you were
That's
talking
really
about.
it.
And once you get there, you go, what's an extra buck if I have to work for that guy or work in this place
Yeah.
or whatever it is. You got to get to that point though, right?
Susan had a comment.
I think in terms of the intangibles, and I think there are some great intangibles here, right? But I think you want to strategically use those things to attract the best people to come and talk to you and get them in. But then I'm a big believer, if you have people that you like and who are really good at what they do, which is the consistent feedback we get, then you compensate those people like the best and the brightest. And you want to keep them, I agree, turnover, it just is a killer.
I like to talk about, and you guys are probably familiar with, like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? So if you think about that, if I can't make ends meet, if I can't pay my rent and put gas in my car, I can't even talk to you about the rest of the things there. I can't even focus on them, right? I have to move up into past those bottom blocks on the pyramid before now those things start to make a difference. And I think that different employees weigh it differently. Newer, younger employees earlier in their career, it's what is my cash? What is the money I'm bringing home? Your employees that are a little bit older, that are thinking about retirement, they're looking at those retirement plan contributions. They're like, yeah. And that's what keeps, in my view, employees stay for a career in the public sector. It's the benefits and the culture that keeps them in the public sector for their career. Most of them could earn more money in a career in the private sector, not everybody, but most, but there are a lot of intangibles to being public sector. So they've already, in my view, taken a little bit of a haircut by choosing to work public sector, and to haircut that a little bit more is just a little bit of a risk.
Philosophically, I think the compensation is sort of half of the equation. When I go back to my earlier years, we wanted to pay above average, and we, between the 50th and 75th percentile, and we wanted to have above average working conditions as well. The flip side of that was we expected above average performance. And so I think, we're talking about one half of the situation. I think if we have those same kinds of performance expectations, then it makes sense to have,
Agreed.
good compensation,
Right.
good working conditions, and versus our competitors.
And in my sense is you probably have a group of residents that have fairly high expectations for the services that are delivered by this city, which is also what I see in the resort communities, which is why I understand that comparison, right? When I work with Steamboat and Estes, right, and Aspen and Vail, they have very high expectations, and maintaining a consistent staff is a huge part of delivering to those expectations, because as you churn and bring people in, the people who generally pay the price for that, it's in the service levels to the residents.
Any other questions? We do have about 5 minutes. Rob?
Well, I guess that, I think when we're looking at individual cases, hiring entry-level A and entry-level, B in different cities, I hear what you're saying. I think where that expectation or the intangibles may not work is maybe at the higher end of the spectrum, because I just got to, I do think if we are even on our pay scale, there are some of those, as Jim just said, it's nice to drive here and a pretty mountain view and et cetera, and we don't have bridges falling down and blah, blah, blah. But at some point, you're right, I understand that, an intangible doesn't fill my dinner table. But at the same time, to our fiercest fiscal critic who would say, why are we overpaying? We should be paying the amount necessary, and if we think that this person is so fabulous or that our expectations are so much higher, the job salary really isn't X, it should be X plus 10. And, or if somebody's doing a really fabulous job, then we give them bonuses. But we don't build in a higher pay scale because you might get an average performer getting a higher pay, a bonus pay scale. And I guess I want to make sure that we can say to our fiercest critics that this works for retention, it works for a whole lot of reasons, but probably the biggest one that I heard that it works for is that as a city, every time we lose somebody, we have to retrain, and the expense of turnover is not an insignificant piece. So it's worth wanting to keep folks that are good.
100% agree with that. And I would say the tool that we use most often when we are presenting pay recommendations to councils that have huge dollars attached to them because they are significantly behind is we run a cost of turnover analysis for them and show them the dollars that have been slowly bleeding out the door, real dollars that have been bleeding out the door every year with turnover. And suddenly what you realize is it's actually cheaper to pay more to your employees because turnover will eat you alive. Right, it will, and we can do very specific calculations unique to your organization to like bring life to those numbers.
And I think in particular, if you have people who are underpaid compared to the market rate, if you lose those people, when you bring new people in who perhaps have less experience, less qualifications, you're going to be paying them more. So, rather than thinking of it as sort of a bonanza that we've got people willing to, perhaps have been willing to work for us for a while for less than what they could make elsewhere. If we lose those people, we're going to be paying that amount for probably somebody who doesn't have nearly the experience and certainly not the direct experience and knowledge. So,
Recruiting is what sinks you to market rate, whether you want to be or not.
exactly.
I have one more question. One of the things that we're looking at, that the police chief has asked us to look at is a shift to a pension. Did you do any analysis around that?
I didn't do analysis on that, but what I can tell you is that is very common. It is what I see more than half the time among more than half of our public safety agencies in the area. Many of them are doing pension versus doing defined benefit versus defined contribution, which is the exact opposite of what we're seeing in the general government side. They're almost always, right, defined contribution. It is generally pension or defined benefit that we see in public safety. It's very common. And it's something that officers look for, right? When they've got 20 organizations they can live in the same house and look for, that's definitely something they're looking at.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. I appreciate your time.
So at 6:26, we have 4 minutes if anyone needs to take a quick break, grab a drink, whatever.
I guess we should also say thanks to Catherine as well for all that hard work working with Graves. So thank you, Catherine.
All right. All right, it is 6:30 on Tuesday, the 19th, and I will call to order the city council meeting. Will the clerk please call the roll?
Counselor Eber?
Here.
Counselor Holen?
Here.
Counselor Wheel?
Happy to be here.
Counselor Sheldon?
Here.
Counselor Blum is absent. Counselor McGuire?
Here.
Please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And I'm going to give Laura a minute to make sure the timer is working. Okay. Insert name here. Okay. Audience participation. We have Tori Leviton.
Good evening to all. Troy Leviton, 3901 East Quincy Avenue. And Happy New Year to those who celebrate New Year at this time of year. I actually think it's a great time to start over with the year. I'm also sorry for giving you guys grief about 90 Mead Lane. I myself signed that and didn't care to read the finer print on that. And I apologize for that as well. And I hope you can also find forgiveness for me for my missteps this year. I really like what you did with the crier over the spring. I like that we're kind of shifting towards we don't need every lawn perfectly manicured mowed. That some wild is good for all of us. And I also want to thank you for your hard work finding 3 amazing new members of PTRC. I love all 3 of them. Great job with that. I'm also hosting a concert at John Mead Park, actually Alan Hutto. But as you can tell from the weather this whole year, we are prepared to shift it over to the pavilion that's covered if needed. And that's October 1st, 5 o'clock. Should give 30 minutes if you go into the trail walk at Quincy Farm. 30 minutes, enough to transition if you want to come hear some live music at the park. We have some local talent coming up from Colorado Springs, a trumpet player that's also going through Northwestern Alumni Association and promoting it that way. You're all invited to come at 5 o'clock on October 1st. Thank you, and that's all.
Are you playing at that concert as well?
I am playing. We have some singers. I have that guy coming back,
Excellent.
my piano duelist.
Yeah.
Which he's, COVID and stuff. We were trying to have a series of house concerts, and that did not work. But yeah, it's going to be a pretty diverse program. We actually have some students in the neighborhood that are also going to be performing. It's going to be kind of open mic, so if you want to come and sing, I'll back you up, Katie. Mayor Brown.
I think, nobody needs to hear that, but thank you so much.
Surely, and we'll go till dark or however we feel safe, depending on the weather. My lighting's decent at the pavilion, so we might even go past 6:30 or 7. We'll see what the demand is.
Excellent. Thank you.
So, arts at the park. Any other questions, comments?
I would just say, and maybe this was in the crier, but if you let the crier know like 6 weeks ahead, 6 weeks or 8 weeks ahead of time.
We have
Deadline
to be
was
careful about
last
whether
Friday,
it's
but
through the Arts Commission or whether it's
Last
independent.
Friday for next month, but yeah.
So this one's independent. I did have that concert through the crier that was through the Arts Commission. They've been really bogged down with these sculptures, so I'm just doing this. It's a private resident for fun. And even though I'm on PTRC, it's not related other than they're invited. So yes, if it's crier, it'll have to be through the Arts Commission in the city.
Yeah.
And that's not likely to happen at least the rest of this calendar year.
It doesn't have to be through the Arts Commission for the crier to put something in it, does it?
What's the...
We'll do a nonprofit organization event. We don't usually do individual resident events.
My bad.
But actually, now that I have Northwestern Alumni Association as a nonprofit as a host, yes, if I get further ahead, that could possibly work in the future.
Yeah.
So I appreciate that.
Great.
All right.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you all. Stay dry. Have a great night.
You too. Reports from members of city boards and commissions. Seeing none, we'll move to the consent agenda.
Move to approve the consent agenda?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? That passes unanimously. There are no items removed. Unfinished business, Resolution 29, Series 2023, amending the city's traffic calming policy. Director Goldie.
Good evening, Mayor, members of council. Here again in front of you is Resolution 29, Series 2023. We have been working on this traffic calming policy with staff and council for, actually we started in 2018 with the original amendment that we started with. But we have been trying to get this updated for a while now, so hopefully staff has put together a policy that council can pass tonight. The goal of the neighborhood traffic calming policy is, first of all, make sure our roadways are safe for pedestrians, vehicles, all of our users. We want to make sure that our policy is consistent, that there are documented problems, and that the residents are involved in the process. So this new policy takes into account all of these goals. Just a little background here. So this will be our third look at this year. We had a study session, and then in July, we talked to council again about it. Council asked us to table this and rearrange the policy, which I believe that was Councilor Holen that asked for that. And in hindsight, that was great. I think we came out with a better product, and I will go over one of those products here real quick that came out of that. And so this is that product. We worked hard as a staff to try to simplify this. So we came up with this outline that is in your packets. But we believe this will be very helpful for our residents when they come in and have a problem with traffic calming. It takes the entire policy, puts it into this 6-step program, really simplifies it so they understand everything they have to do. There's no hidden surprises. And then also, council does not see these until there's an actual decision to be made on funding. There's no subjectivity into it and asking council to make decisions based on wants and needs, not actual documented problems. So we're hoping this clears all that up, and when any of these come in front of council, it will be, do we want to fund that? Not, is this necessary? That by the time it gets to council, all of that will be worked out, that it's warranted, necessary, and should be done. So the program, you won't see anything different between Public Works and the police department. The police have initiated their new traffic division. They're already doing these things as they get requests for the speed trailer, for extra patrol. So you really won't see any difference in the initiation. Behind the scenes, it will be our two departments coordinating more to make sure that we're doing the data collection at the right time, not at the same time they're doing speed control in a neighborhood, because then we're going to have some real low speeds. So Public Works Department has begun to put together some of the materials, pamphlets, mailings, yard signs. We'll continue to get that out, so when the requests start coming, we have that information for our residents to move forward with the process. So in conclusion, again, the proposed policy is designed to help determine upfront if there are warranted speeding problems. No guessing, no going through processes and then be told no. Education and enforcement are going to be the required steps before we go to any physical changes. Again, education through community output, education through the PD doing their traffic stops, talking to people, not necessarily issuing tickets, but education is the big thing. And then encouraging that involvement from the residents and making that mandatory so they understand that, we're trying to get this education through, and sometimes talking to your neighbors is all it really takes. It doesn't take a speed hump or a physical change to the street. It takes a little communication. And so by having objective and measurable criteria, staff feels that we can avoid some of the conflicts that we've seen in the past with residents in here not very happy at the process. So we're hoping that this new policy will be a very positive thing. That is all staff has. I can take any questions at this time.
I have a couple of questions. In step one, project initiation, if there's no documentation, no documented speeding issue, the applicant will be notified that no further action will be taken. In that, will you explain to them why? It's not just going to be a letter of we did a study.
No, we'll actually call them and say,
Go through
it, send them the information, and talk to them about here's why
okay,
there's no documented issue.
right.
Yeah, no, it's not going to just be a Dear John letter that says,
for
you don't meet the criteria, thanks.
I appreciate that, thank you. And then on the next page, the impact area meeting. I'm assuming that's just here's what we're not, the city is coordinating it.
Yeah.
That is just an informational disbursement meeting?
Yes.
There's no vote, there's no.
No vote, no.
Input asked?
Correct. That is, one of your neighbors requested this, it's warranted, here's what we're looking at, and taking ideas, do
You will solicit feedback?
yes, some people will say, no matter what, I don't want a speed bump, or, no matter what, I don't want bump outs or islands, whatever it is, or here's what we'd like to see. So then we'll take that input and not just have our traffic engineer put a plan together without listening to the
So it's
residents
to solicit
first.
input?
Yep.
Okay, thank you. That's all. Earl?
I just wanted to say, I applaud the rewrite. I thought you guys did a great job rewriting the policy, much clearer, I thought, and I really liked the outline. I thought that was really, really helpful at the end of the day. So, good job with it overall.
Thank you.
Rob?
I know I raised this the last time we discussed this. I still am a little concerned with the narrowness of the definition of impact area. I know there are a lot of communities that have HOAs, and there is a requirement for everybody that has a covenant-controlled HOA. I think there are a number of neighborhoods that, like mine, that have a covenant, have an HOA, but I'm not sure we have any teeth, frankly. But we did have an incident where we looked at this, and the neighborhood was pretty upset with the limitations on the size of the impact area. And so I'd rather be over than under with respect to making sure that people are brought into the process early. I would almost say it attaches to a whole neighborhood, not just the immediate street. In our particular issue, it was because the street is often used as a way to get to other neighborhoods. And so only notifying the people on that individual street might have been less helpful than it could have been had we been broadened it out. So I just ask for us to consider whether or not we've got the right definition of impact area. The other thing that I mentioned, and I mentioned it again last time, is I'm the guy out there yelling at my neighbors. Probably not a surprise to Jim Thorson that I would be the guy out there, but I think Earl, you mentioned
That was
were.
you?
That was me. Usually, and I will tell you, I've been yelled at, I've been cussed at, I've been flipped off. I have been treated unbelievably rudely by my neighbors and my fellow citizens and some people who are just passing through the village. And I continue to be nervous about this, and I know, Earl, you and I disagree here a little bit. I continue to be nervous about putting the onus for a city speeding problem on a city street, that the burden is being put on individual residents to do that outreach and education. I think it's a great idea. I think in this time and age where violence erupts seemingly out of nowhere, that we are putting, or could be putting, individuals at risk. That I think this speed is not just a neighborhood, it's really a city problem. Our particular area, you know, we do have people, and it probably applies to anybody on the fringe of the city that has the ability to be a through street for somebody else, is, you know, we have lots of people who are going through different neighborhoods en route to other parts. And so, yeah, they are our neighbors within Cherry Hills Village, but they're not our immediate neighbors within our each respective neighborhood. And so I'm nervous about that. I would like to, you know, maybe I just got to get over it and say that's the way it is, but
That was
I'm a
one
little
of,
nervous.
That was one of my notes as well. I think that there's a key difference in this new proposed policy that changes the nature of the discussion a little bit. And it is that now we are saying that if there isn't a defined problem, that's the end. And so while I shared your concern about the impact area, when our policy was that even if there wasn't a problem, you could do something about it anyway, in that scenario, I did feel like we needed to get more input from people who might have thoughts on the matter. Now we're talking about a defined speeding problem. And I think you're right, Rob, that this is, now once we know that there is a real issue, I don't know that I feel comfortable saying, and I'm going to push the responsibility for addressing it off on the person who brought it up completely. I do think that engaging the community and the awareness campaign and the let's try to see if we can just talk to people before we go to these great lengths of, you know, installing traffic calming measures and bump outs and whatever. I do think that's an important part, and I do think the community needs to be involved in that. But this does place kind of all of that responsibility for addressing a defined problem within the city on, you know, a member of the community who was brave enough to step up in the first place. So I'm a little uncomfortable with that too. Earl, it looks like you
But I guess one thing though is it's not putting it entirely. I mean, this doesn't say that if there's a defined problem, the chief and the department of police are just going to ignore it. I mean, there are going to be other things that the city does. I'm sure that the police department, if they know that there's a speeding issue going on, they're going to be looking at it. This is to sit back and say, hey, do you want a traffic calming measure on your street? The city's going to do other things to try to deal with it at that point in time. But if you want a traffic calming measure, this is the process you need to go through. And I'm comfortable with that.
Well, and I would say that the neighborhood outreach program is only one small step, because once they do that outreach, talk to their neighbors, and we do another speed study, then we do take over.
Well, I
Now
would say
that
it's one
there's-
huge step, right? If you're an HOA with 500 homes, getting 80% of those people to sign off that's a big step.
Yeah, and that doesn't change. That's the current policy. It's the
Right,
residence requirement.
but that was in the case that it wasn't a speeding problem,
Yes, that was,
right? That getting 80% of the signatures was if you just wanted it anyway.
yeah.
You didn't have to do that if the results came back that there in fact was a defined problem. And I guess that's where this shift is. I'm trying to weave those two things together. I'm glad that we're not going to, you know, pursue that anymore, because I think that was the cause of most of the angst. But once the city knows of a defined problem, I do feel like the city should be actively engaged in proposing a solution. And Earl, to your point, I do think the question is, okay, well, this is one possible solution. Do you, the community, the HOA, the impacted area, whatever, do you want that? You know, maybe the solution is worse than the problem in your opinion. So I think that we shouldn't just plow forward without community input. I'm just wondering if there isn't an opportunity, or if the city shouldn't take on a little more of the burden of conducting that public outreach, rather than putting it all on, one
To be
person.
clear, the public outreach, you have to establish that you have reached out either in person, by letter, or a door hanger to 75% of the homes on the impacted area.
Correct.
Is that right?
Yes.
So it could be just as simple as sending a letter out.
No, you have to get a petition signed with.
Well, then there's data collection, again, a second data collection. And then if there is still a speeding problem, then you go to the petition. Maybe instead of having to collect 80%, is it 80%? Maybe there's a mailing, I don't know who does it, the city or and if more than 20% object, so that then puts the onus on the people who don't
We know
want
people
it.
who object speak up, right? So,
Well,
I mean,
yeah, but I think
that's-
it's going to be, that's an easier thing to determine than saying, I need to get 80% of people to sign something. You only have to wait and see if anybody objects. I'm
That's
just
the
saying
thought.
that
Yeah,
may
no,
be
yeah, I
something
know.
that's less.
And the people who object are more
onerous.
likely to speak up
Anyway,
than the people who
who
support.
don't care.
I see Jim pulling the microphone.
Yeah. Well, a couple of things I'll just chime in on. I think, although a novel idea, something I hadn't heard before about getting the people that object to it, I think it'd be very difficult to carry around a petition, trying to find somebody who objects.
No, she's saying don't
You do
have
it.
an
The city
objection.
does, city or the person does a mailer to everybody in the neighborhood or the
Okay.
impacted area and says,
Okay.
if you object, you
By
need to
this
notify.
date.
By this
Okay,
date, you need
okay,
to
I
sign
got
this
it.
and send it to the
Yeah,
city.
that could definitely work.
I think it's less of a burden.
Yeah, and I was thinking about while we were talking, the 80% of a association, as Mayor Brown pointed out, you almost never get that vote anyway.
Yeah.
I think Randy can attest to that with his media and on Bellevue. But I will say maybe that could be lowered for an association, something 55% or some number in there that would be more accommodating to a larger organization. I think that the thought is that we had set it up so that those people that abut the street are really the ones impacted. I know correctly that Councilmember Eber talked about those that use the street, but at the same time, it's those people that live on it that have the highest impact.
And again, for me, there is just a very distinguishable difference between a problem that needs to be addressed and just wanting something because you want it, right? When you want something because you want it, then the wants and needs of the other people have to be factored in more. When there's a problem that needs to be a safety problem that needs to be addressed by the city, as Earl has said in the past, to some extent, what people who use the street want doesn't weigh as heavily as those who are impacted by the safety implications of having people speeding down their street.
But hang on one second here. I think this is a question, actually. I don't know the answer. I think I know it, but I don't know. This is with regard to if citizens want to install calming measures. This has nothing to do with what city council can do. We can go put traffic things anytime we want. We can make a policy and put them on every street we want. This doesn't have anything to do with that. This is with regard to our citizens on a particular area saying, we want to do this. Okay, great, we're providing a mechanism for you to do that. And this is the mechanism that you do it with. The city is going to be looking at other aspects associated with maintaining, order on their streets and what have you, through our police department and what have you. And if there's something else going on that we think is dangerous to the public, it doesn't matter what the citizens want. We're going to take action. And this policy has nothing to do with that.
Well, it kind of does, though.
Not
Yeah,
really.
that kind of confuses me a little bit. I understand that this applies to sort of resident-initiated problems. And maybe I would hope that we have the same kind of discipline and having warrants met and, you know, a defined problem that we're really trying to solve. And engagement with the community and all of the aspects of this program, even if it was council initiated. I don't know that this is 100% fit, but it doesn't feel like that process should be radically different. You know, if we.
I agree with you. No. I'm not saying that we would, and the point is that I think I'm just saying this concern that the city wouldn't take any action if there's a defined problem or there's an issue. Some egregious thing that happened, it doesn't matter, you know, at the end of the day, we're gonna do what we need to do. But this might be controversial, and there's a difference between the 20% objection and the 80%. The 20% objection thing that's gonna be harder to have those 20% come than to get the 80%. We're basically saying we don't want speed bumps in our communities, okay? This is supposed to be a hurdle to get over. That's always been the situation. We're not interested in doing it. If our citizens really want it, then we will give it to them, and that's the way to do it. But ordinarily, that's not something that we're going to be doing.
So I actually don't think of this policy that way. I think, and when you read the first sentence, the following procedures have been developed to identify and address traffic, speed, and safety concerns on residential streets in Cherry Hills Village. The point of the policy is not to solely handle, you know, citizens' complaints. It's not solely to, you know, discourage people from putting in traffic calming. The point of traffic calming procedures is to develop a procedure to use to address the safety concerns on our roads. And so, kind of to Randy's point, the way we're going to hear about speeding concerns, I mean, it's possible that our police just happen to notice problem areas, but the way we're going to hear about problem areas is that somebody's going to come forward and say, people are speeding on my street. And they're not necessarily saying, you know, we want speed humps. A lot of times they are, but they want the speeding to stop. Right. And this is the procedure. The traffic calming procedure needs to be the general procedure that we're going to go through to try to address that concern. And so, you know, I have other questions in here that the procedure does really focus on speed humps. It mentions that there are some other options, you know, but that's not the only thing we're talking about here. It's what 90% of the time, you know, people come to us with the solution already in mind. But so I think that if we became aware of a speeding problem through some other mechanism, I think we should still go through a procedure similar to this. And it's the threshold for me, is different when this is addressing a defined problem and not just something that somebody wants because they want it.
No, I agree. And again, I didn't mean to say that we'd ignore this policy. I'm saying, because the thing was, hey, there's a defined problem and we're putting it back on the residents. I don't think that's what we're doing. The city has the opportunity to address any issue it wants to. I mean, I'm basically pushing back on that argument. And once it's pushed back, I'm not saying, hey, I want to obviate this policy. This council wouldn't do that. This one wouldn't. I don't think any future ones would. And again, the next thing is that residents could sit back and go, and I'm sure they do, is sit back and they call the police, hey, there's speeding going up and down Dahlia constantly. Chief, what are you doing about it? And I don't think it's ignored, is it? I mean, maybe that would be occurring, that would be happening. And if it's not satisfactory and the residents they might look to implement this at that point in time. But the city's not going to ignore problems. This is just a mechanism to allow citizens to proceed down a path for things for a thing that they want to do, which basically is speed humps at the end of the day. I mean, that's really what we're talking about.
Could be bump outs, could be islands.
They generally want speed humps, but.
Yeah, there's
Let me
other
ask you this,
solutions.
though. I mean, maybe the solution is that you have language in here that says this policy is to address citizen-initiated review procedures, is for citizen-initiated items. The city retains all of its rights and authorities to address conditions on its roadway, you know, kind of have that reservation. I don't want to be the lawyer. I'm going to appoint her to be the lawyer to draft the language that says the city retains all of its rights to handle its streets any way we want. And it could even have at the next sentence, it says, to the extent that the procedures in this policy are applicable and relevant to a discussion by the city, they would be followed or considered.
There are two things that trouble me with that. One, I really like the objectivity of this. You know, it sort of says, we either have a problem or we don't have a problem. And if we have a real problem for the warrants and all of that, then we start marching down a problem solution process. And that feels good, whether it's resident initiated or it's council initiated. The other thing that troubles me is if we make an exception, well, let's see, I'm a resident, I think there's a bunch of speeding going on in my neighborhood. I know my council member, I can go ahead and maybe do a workaround this process and short circuit it, and that doesn't feel good either. You know, I don't know why we wouldn't be held to the same standards and processes that the residents would be.
I would agree with that. Let me also just a few little things. On the first page, under the petition paragraph, the second,
Which page on, Katie?
I'm sorry, the first page of the traffic calming procedures. I'll give you all on your iPads a time to
Got it, yeah.
see how many have count finger swipes. Okay. Under the petition paragraph towards the bottom of the page, second sentence, all property owners are given only one vote, and only the owners on the property title must sign the document, no renters. I think it's must probably needs to be may. And then when we get to step 4, so the next page, so you've gone through this whole process. You've gotten your petition with 80% of the signatures, which, like, you know, Cherry Hills North has brought this conversation up, or individuals in Cherry Hills North have brought this conversation up. And that is going to be a huge lift to get 80% of the people in Cherry Hills North to sign a petition. But let's assume for a second that they've done it. It says, so the staff comes up with a preliminary plan, and it says they'll review the preliminary plan with the applicant. So this is, all of a sudden, we now have one individual who has stepped forward and has taken initiative and has expressed a concern. And this individual is now, like, everything falls on the HOA is not involved anymore.
Well, you're still having the impact area meeting.
You've had but that one person has to organize it. Like the applicant or something. I mean,
Well, the question though is, when it comes time to the solution, it says the applicant instead of the whole neighborhood. So the onus on resolution to the whole neighborhood is through the one person applicant. And I guess my question is that the time when you're discussing solutions that there shall be a community meeting between the city and everybody else to attempt to implement a resolution so that it doesn't fall just on that applicant to represent the whole neighborhood?
And that's
Nothing
what,
that says the HOA can't be the.
it says a meeting will be held with the district council member and area residents to discuss the plan.
So,
but it says that the applicant's going to coordinate it, and you're going to take those preliminary plans and show it to the applicant as if that applicant is some sort of representative of the neighborhood, which they're not.
So do you think that
That's-
rather than that step, the city should notify people in the impacted area that there will be a public meeting?
I'm kind of like in Rob's idea right now that starting in step 4, the applicant is out of it now, and it becomes a city
Initiated
a
process.
city-initiated process. There is a defined problem. The neighbors and the concerned people have gone and gotten their petition with all those signatures on it. They've spoken. They've said that's what they want. So at this point, now the city's going to take it over.
So you eliminate the first bullet point, and the second bullet point says the city will coordinate instead of the applicant.
Yeah, once the plan has been prepared, yes, okay. I guess I would move this sentence, the preliminary plan will provide approximate locations. I'd move that up. So it says, upon completion of certified petition in step 3, city staff will prepare a preliminary traffic calming plan, period. The preliminary plan will provide approximate locations for the speed humps, curb extensions, landscape medians, and all associated signage. And then you would have,
The city staff.
yeah, the city staff will coordinate a public impact area meeting that will include an invitation to the district council member and everyone who signed the petition. And then upon completion, the city will coordinate city council hearing. That stays the same.
Yeah, that's okay. I don't have a problem with that. Now, you added, and everyone that signed the petition, that's the area impact area. I mean, they're notifying that you don't, that's.
Yeah, you're right.
You don't need to say that. I'm good with that.
Okay. Then moving on to the next
Sorry,
page.
so back up. Where did we end up with the 80%? Are we still going to require?
Yeah, are
that
we still at 80%?
Someone has to get
or-
80%, or is it going to be if 20% of the people notify the city that they're not in favor of it?
I'm a believer in affirmative. I know it's a heavy lift, but I'd rather it make a really good statement that we want to change rather than we don't want this, because that doesn't move the ball along. That's just negative Nellies.
Well, you just put all of the onus back on the applicant.
And I know that there are HOAs that have a majority rules, 51%
That's where.
carries the day. So should the city's bar be higher? Don't know. I mean, my neighborhood, if we have 51% to go approve some new capital expenditure or project we want to do, 51% carries the day. Whereas this procedure would require our neighborhood to go get 80% of the people to say they wanted speed bumps. So at one point, I don't know who said it, but somebody said maybe an HOA might be looked at or treated differently. Don't know if that makes any sense. to
Yeah,
have an
I
HOA
said that.
have the bar be a little lower if it's within an HOA, and if it's not an HOA community, the bar's higher? I don't know if that makes sense.
So what you said totally resonated with me, but let me play devil's advocate for just a second. The difference, as I see it, between the 51% is that that's dealing with your HOA and
Common
private
areas.
property.
It doesn't,
And
yeah,
this is
HOA doesn't
public
deal with the
streets.
Right.
Yeah, good point.
So maybe 80%, I mean, it is a heavy lift, but maybe it needs to be a heavy lift.
It does, well, I think it needs to be a heavy lift because again, people that want a traffic calming measure want it. There are a lot of people that don't like it. In fact, I tend to think that there are more people that don't like it than do like it. Again, this is not a preferred solution. This is just my view at the end of the day. It's not a preferred solution. We don't like these kinds of things at the end of the day. But if the citizens want it in an overwhelming majority,
But
They're
Earl,
gonna
this
get
is
it.
also where there is an established issue with speeding, that the prior steps that have been taken haven't done anything to stop. And that's why I am coming around to your way of thinking is, if we know there's a problem. Well, I don't know that we'd have liability if we don't do, actually I have no idea, but it seems to me we shouldn't make it a heavy lift because we want to solve the problem.
but, well, you know, you know, and I guess
And
everybody's
it's
going
not
to have a
necessarily
different view.
speed humps.
Right, I'm going to sit back, I'm going to call the chief and go, you need to start putting somebody out there and letting people know that we're going to, and ticket the living you-know-what out of them. I mean, that's what I'm going to do. Now, I guess you're right. I mean, we could be doing that, all of a sudden it dies down, and the minute he's gone, they start right back up again. That's possible. I think it's unlikely.
Well, so here, let me say this. I think I could get comfortable with two different solutions to that. One might be, maybe it's a heavy lift, but not quite an 80% heavy lift. Maybe it's 65. Or, I know this is kind of contrary to what Rob said, but again, because it's a problem, so what I envision is, you know, a neighborhood where the people who live on the road where everybody is speeding are very frustrated and are very supportive of the speed humps. But the other people in the HOA who are the people speeding because they're using that road to get to their house, all refuse to sign the petition.
There's a third category though. Because of the speed bumps being on street X, everybody is now diverting to street Y and causing a traffic problem over on Y, but they aren't in the impact area. So that was my argument.
Right.
Why the impact area is not only those directly impacted, but those who suffer the consequential impacts of a decision on X street.
Well, and that's why I'm starting to think, though, that because that's a slightly different scenario from a lot of our other neighborhoods. Like use Charlevoix, for example. You know, the circle in the back isn't going to be the problem area. It's going to be what's that main road?
That Main Street.
Yeah, or when you come in off that right. Yeah, so that's going to be the problem area, and you could see the people who live all the way in the back being like, "No, there's no problem at all."
Why don't we get rid of the HOA? Why does
Well,
that
that's
need to
what
be
I'm
in
saying.
there?
So I'm
Get rid of
saying
it.
maybe just take out the concept of the HOA. The impact area is defined as the impact area,
Exactly.
whether it's part of the
makes more
HOA or
sense.
not. And it needs to be broad enough that it's really truly taking in the people who are impacted by it, but not necessarily the entire HOA.
There is some benefit, I think, to having the HOA and HOA, if they exist, as the potential applicant, because they've got mechanisms to get out there and communicate to all the residents. They've got ways to get the residents to respond, and that machinery is a lot easier to tap into as a resident of that neighborhood than to go out and figure it out, you know, hang things on doors.
Well, there's
There's
nothing
no prohibition,
preventing
I
it.
don't think, the way we're structuring this to a community saying, you know, soliciting their HOA to be the front man.
Okay.
Yeah, I think, you know, like looking at Cherry Hills North, Hudson cuts across the middle of it. You know, that's, if you wanted to address a speeding problem there, you'd have to go get 500 homes.
Yeah.
Right, and so let's just maybe eliminate the thing that says that the impact area is the whole HOA and just say the impact area is going to be defined the way we define impact area.
And just to be clear, the way this whole shift that we're doing now is taking out the potential for a neighborhood to come in and say, we know there's no problem here. We don't think there's a problem. We want them anyway. We're willing to pay for them, and we're willing to get the signatures. They can't do that under this proposed policy, correct?
That's correct.
That's correct.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, so if we remove that HOA, and the place I would then make sure that we do add the HOA back in, if we're eliminating them from earlier steps, is that the public impact area meeting will include an invitation to the district council member and any relevant HOA.
That doesn't mean everybody in the HOA, it's just the notice person with the city for the HOA. It's giving the HOA notice.
Okay,
HOA can do what they choose.
Exactly.
okay.
I like that.
And it's not giving the HOA a right to vote, it's strictly information.
Right, like, we're just making sure that we're disseminating the information if there's an HOA. So then moving on to the next page, the traffic calming warrants. people might be fine with this. I just didn't want it to get glossed over. The first thing, street type, lists 6 specific streets. I just want to make sure everyone,
That are not eligible.
right, read those 6 specific streets that are not eligible for speed humps, and that you have given thought to that and that you're comfortable with that list. Okay. Traffic volume. It says residential streets must have a minimum of 200 vehicles per day. Streets that have more than 100 but less than 200, why do you care? If you just said that you have to have a minimum of 200, then there can't be any requirements for between 100 and 200 because they're not eligible anyway.
If you swap the sentences and put the 100 to 200 requires another step, but if you're at 200 or greater, does not require the extra step. I think that's the intent.
But I think Jay's going to jump in and tell us that must be something based on some formal federal state.
No, that's just based on, we don't want you to have to meet the 200 minimum if there's an accident issue,
Okay.
not a speeding issue, an accident issue.
Just add notwithstanding the foregoing, comma. Streets that have more than 100 but less than 200 may also meet the requirements.
Or I guess, yeah, so rather than must also, it probably just needs to say streets that have more than 100 and take out that dash, but less than 200 ADT can be eligible if they meet the requirements outlined below in accident data.
Didn't it say earlier you have to meet all of the warrants?
Yes, but there's a,
But it's
there's a
not really,
caveat
because it's
to
either
that.
you have to meet the traffic volume warrant or the accident.
Yes, and that's the caveat with the star
So
there.
maybe there's a way to put those in the same block as an either or.
Well, it actually just says traffic calming measures will not be approved unless warrants are met. It doesn't say all warrants.
It does elsewhere in
Oh, it does?
policy.
Okay.
But at the bottom, we try to clarify that accident data can be used in place of speeding data. You don't have to meet both of those.
Okay.
Okay. So maybe, yeah, if there's a reference to all warrants, maybe it just needs to say warrants.
Okay.
Well, then I think that's going to be confusing because people may say, well, I meet one of these.
Yeah, okay.
I think
Well,
it should stay all, but yeah, maybe a little clearer.
Be more clear about that. Okay.
Asterisk.
I think for speed and accident data, you have those asterisks. I think it's important, this keeps coming up, that people feel like we're just making those numbers up. And I think that there needs to be some footnote or something as to where this 85th percentile comes from. Yeah, just,
We can add a footnote.
yes, I think that would be great, because that's not our number, that's somebody else's number.
Can I go back real quick, Mayor? I kind of want to make sure that we've addressed Randy's point on the reservation of authority or why this wouldn't apply, and I want to make sure that we kind of understand where we're going on that is, I'm from the camp that this is for citizen-initiated processes. I don't necessarily think it's a bad idea to apply to us, but I'm from the camp that the government reserves all of our rights and authorities with respect to our roads that we may ever need to. And if we choose to follow this and may want to highly consider it or highly, use it unless a reason for departure or some type of language like that we can draft in there, but I'm really nervous about limiting governmental authorities, and where it was going to come in even before Randy mentioned it was the idea that I would want this policy to make sure that we understand that it applies only to changes that are made purely for traffic calming purposes, and it doesn't get used as a means to limit our authority for making other road improvements for a completely separate authority, reason, I guess I'd say. And one comes into play is, let's say we've got a road that is become very straight, but we want to put it back firmly in the middle of a right-of-way. We may make it more curvy, not because of traffic calming, but because we want to recenter that road within the right-of-way. Yeah, it has a traffic calming effect, but it is not solely for that purpose. And I want to make sure that this policy doesn't hamstring the public works folks into not being able to make any changes that they need.
Well, I don't think, because it specifically says it's to identify and address traffic speed and safety concerns. So
Well, but
you know,
I
it
think
has
where
nothing to
goes
do
is-
with
Well, but I think
right away or
what-
road design or anything.
No, but there could be a situation where the city decides because of traffic speed or safety concerns that they want to close a road or put speed bumps or a stop sign or something. And we don't want 80% or 20% of the neighborhood to be able to say, no, we don't want you doing that.
And I would
There
just
may be a
clar-
reason that we've decided, I mean, so maybe this should say to address those concerns raised by residents.
And I would say the city always retains its right to be able to put in traffic improvements as deemed appropriate by the city. This is a citizen initiated application process, and that's all this is.
Well, but
But I
that goes
think-
back to where we were earlier,
I think
saying
that's got to
exactly
say that. I'm picking up, it doesn't say that at this point in time, and I think it's, because we got to communicate, because the residents will come back and say, hey, you guys are going against your own policy. No, we're not. I think we do probably need to have
This is
a
for
line or
citizen
two in there
initiated.
that says basically what you just said, Jim. I mean, to make it clear, that's what this is for.
We can add a sentence in there that would clarify that.
And I don't have a problem with that. I just think that, I guess as a council, we've got to kind of hold ourselves to similar standards, not just run around putting in speed bumps, you know, any old place, that sort of thing. Not that we would, but, you know, there's kind of a spirit of this as well, I think, that is beyond the, but yeah.
I would
it's-
agree that it's
a
advisable,
risk.
but that it probably needs to specify that
Right.
we don't
Resident- and the
necessarily
spirit thing-
have to.
And the spirit thing is you're talking about is basically philosophical, but you're not talking about adding something in the
No,
policy.
no,
Right,
I'm
okay.
okay with developing a policy for traffic calming that's resident initiated, you know, those qualifiers.
So if we can add something in there to that effect. So we've had several amendments. We have change a must to a may. We have removing HOA and just having the impacted area. We're adding notification of the input area meeting to HOAs. We're rewording the traffic volume section a little bit. Do you see a new draft? Okay. That's a lot. Yeah.
I think so.
Okay. And then, I actually did have one more that I skipped over. Under road length in the table of warrants, I think there's a few words missing here. I think it needs to say, the road section being considered must be more than 1,000 feet in length for traffic calming measures to be properly installed and have the desired effect. Because it just says they must be more than 1,000 feet in length to properly be installed. And the road set, that.
Thank you for that. That's.
Yeah, so that's just a little text change. Okay, so if we can, when's our next meeting? November?
I've got one more
Yeah.
suggested change. You know, Jay, is there a cost associated with this? Are we going to go out and get traffic counts from a third-party vendor?
No, we actually do traffic counts in-house now.
So is there any outside work that needs to be done in order for a applicant to come in and hit the eligibility and qualifications? Is there any outside?
No, there's no outside cost to that. That's all internal, including patrol as well as the traffic counts and speeds.
So where I'm going is, you know, every time we have any kind of land use application come through, we have a fee that an applicant has to pay. And they then have to keep filling the bucket if they draw down for outside counsel or whatever outside costs might be incurred. I was going to suggest, I was assuming we may have some outside consultants, and if that was the case, and we may still want to do this, but I was going to suggest that there might be a fee that gets deposited with an application. And if warrants are met, that application fee gets fully refunded back to the applicant. Because they brought something to our attention that we didn't know about, that we are now agreeing per the data needs to be fixed.
I will say
But you couldn't know on the front end.
That's where I'm going, is that it might make somebody just pause from doing a willy-nilly request. Hey, we want to go get this done. Let's get this thing started. We want traffic counts to get going.
I will say that there probably will be some costs absorbed by the city as part of a consultant at the very end when there's a design involved. We may hire a traffic engineer at that point in time, depending on what the solution.
But that's not until after the problem is established, right?
We've already identified that there's a problem. We tried the outreach and it hasn't worked and there's still a problem. Now we're going to work on a design. So at that point is when we would actually.
Talk through for me the sequencing of this. What an applicant comes in and says, we want to do this. Do they go get the 80% signatures?
No. They come in and say, we believe we had a speeding problem. We want residents to do that. We want to be able to go out, take those counts, see if there is a problem, send our officers out there to be in the community. We don't want to charge anybody for that. We want, if people believe there's a problem, that's what we're here for. We'll come out, do those things. If there's a true problem, then again, we keep moving. If there's not, then we've been out there and we've tried to help slow their perceived issues.
What do we get 1 or 2 of these a year, maybe?
They seem to come in spurts. We'll get 2 or 3, all at the same time, and then we won't see but 1 or 2 a year. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So no deposit required as an applicant. Okay, I'm fine. I just thought I'd bring it up. Thanks, Mayor.
Anything else? Okay, so our next meeting is October 10th, which is the budget, and it's our only meeting in October. It has a pretty hefty agenda already. Do we want to?
But it shouldn't take long to go through this if we've already made all the changes.
So I think if we either have October 10th or November 7th. What is does staff have a preference?
I think let's shoot for October 10th of this year. And
okay.
And then if we have to change it, it'll be done before we have it final scheduled. But I think October 10th is where we're at.
Yeah. So what we need then is a motion to postpone until October 10th.
I move we postpone the consideration of Resolution 29, Series 2023 until October 10th.
Second?
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, thank you for that discussion. Moving on to new business, Council Bill 7, Series 2023, amending Chapter 4, Article 1 concerning the city's capital fund. And that's Director Farman.
Good evening, Mayor and City Council members. We do have an ordinance on first reading for the consideration of updating the municipal code pertaining to the city's capital fund. Just a brief background, council is already aware, but there is a current capital fund that was created in the city code, section 4150. It's actually pretty well stated in that city code, but where it becomes a little cloudy was there was a budget ordinance approved for the 2011 budget, and it basically referenced the capital fund as an accounting mechanism for expenditures. And so it didn't exactly align with 4150. So for financial reporting and auditing purposes right now, the capital fund is blended with the general fund. Council discussed this at the February retreat and also on September 5th. So tonight's ordinance would accomplish 3 main objectives. This fund would be a tool for long-term financial forecasting. I would propose a 10-year capital fund forecast, and that could be developed based on the capital improvement program that's updated annually. And we could utilize specific assumptions for the capital assets that would be separate from our operating assumptions that we do with the general fund forecast. This fund would also be separately reported and audited, aside from the general fund. And this fund would also be part of the financial planning and reporting to the community, so it improves communication. Included in this redefinition, this fund is would be the major source for the capital improvement program and would incorporate transfers from other funds as main sources of revenue. So not any new revenues, it would be current revenues that would flow through another fund into the capital fund. Revenues could also include grants and other legally restricted revenues, such as the state's highway users tax fund that's required to be used on transportation. This ordinance also stipulates that any unexpended interfund transfers may be returned to the originating fund at council's direction. And for an example would be the general fund. And I think in practice, to really justify this stipulation number 4, we would do a reimbursement on the capital fund expenditures at the end of the year. So we would be only transferring the exact amount spent on general capital assets into the fund. So really there would be no unexpended funds in the capital fund. And then this ordinance also redefines that these revenues would be spent on capital asset acquisition, construction improvements in accordance with the city's capital improvement program policy. We do have a proposed amendment to the ordinance this evening. We did talk to Councilmember Holen, who had some questions and comments that he raised with staff last Friday. And we did realize that we had erroneously omitted the Parks and Recreation Fund. So we would like to add the Parks and Recreation Fund to the third whereas clause in this ordinance, and also add that to section B1 and C that's shown on this slide. So we would add that fund reference to these areas. And if council agrees, this would be the recommended motion as amended this evening on first reading. Be happy to answer any questions.
Randy?
If the capital fund is funded by a variety of sources, some of which are restricted, some of which aren't in their use, how do you keep track of that over time so that we don't end up in a situation where, we've got a pile of money, we spent it on something else, but, can we track the...
Yeah, very good question. Right now we have like the Open Space Fund, we have Conservation Trust Fund. I would propose those funds remain in those specific funds because we do have to report back to the state, and it's a lot easier just to keep those funds where they're at. If we are talking about the HETF or motor vehicle registration fees, which do have some restrictions, right now those are going into the general fund, and you can actually use those for maintenance or administrative costs related to transportation. So it's a little bit more flexible, and when we report to the state annually on those revenues, we include all of those various construction and maintenance and administrative costs to the state. So there's really no reason to or not to put those revenues into the capital fund. And right now they are going into the general fund. I don't know if that makes it any clearer or not.
I'm just trying to be sure we don't end up in a situation where we've taken a
Commingled
fund.
the funds and now we can't.
Right, yes, we do not want to commingle funds, and that's why I would propose like the ARPA, the federal grants, that's the reason why we have a federal grant fund, is to have the revenues and the expenditures all within that fund. So I would propose to keep that with the Open Space Fund and the Conservation Trust, because those are really the only revenue sources and the expenditures within those funds. So it's a lot easier to report.
And we would only transfer funds in.
I think the reason would be on the reporting side is if we would have a reason to report it differently.
Well, I mean, you probably have this figured out. I'm just trying to understand. Okay, Parks and the Parks Fund, funded by a separate mill levy. There's those funds are supposed to be used for park purposes. We've got the general fund, which is a little more, well, it's almost entirely flexible. How, with respect to capital, you know, how do we, you know, mingle those in a sense? I don't know what the funding timing is, what the expenditure is, so that we can feel comfortable. We can demonstrate to our taxpayers, you know, parks money went to parks, and, you know.
I think that's why we have that interfund transfer from the Parks and Recreation Fund that
Okay, so that's
in practice right now. So then all of the Parks and Recreation Fund, the operations and the capital would be within that Parks and Recreation Fund on the financial statements.
Randy, is your question, do you actually have separate, like, bank accounts that you keep restricted funds in? Or is it just an accounting ledger?
Well,
interest,
yeah, I mean,
input?
I'm trying to kind of understand when the funding occurs. You've got a capital plan, it goes out 10 years. You've got a balance in this capital improvement fund that is an amount that presumably is a balance that rolls forward with puts and takes for 10 years. And yet I'm trying to reconcile that with
Some comes from
when-
parks and some comes from
Yeah.
general.
How
And
do
so
you
how
keep
do
it
you make
straight?
sure that the money that came in from parks over that 10-year period is
spent-
going to parks?
Because Parks has only reimbursed exactly what it's spent on parks. So there
Right.
really is no accumulated fund balances in the capital fund that's from the Parks
Okay,
That's
Fund.
so
the
it's
answer.
kind
And which
no
also,
accumulated
and there's a difference of opinion on this, but you guys know mine, which is to go, there aren't any transfers until it's necessary and needed, and it'll happen at the end of each year. Yeah, there's dough in there now, and that'll happen what happens, but when that gets drawn down, at that point, we'll be transferring in year by year. Now, that's not in the policy, but that's what I think we ought to do, rather than transfer it in. But there are other things, there's other discussions, and other people may have different views about that, but my view is you transfer it in when you need, when it's necessary. Now, one of the other things I was curious about too, though, is another fund. What about the Excel fund? And what's the restrictions on that? You know, the 1%, whatever the hell it is?
Oh,
It
that's,
still exists. It's
The 1% is a separate fund. We never see those funds. Those are held by Excel.
It's held by Excel, okay,
Yes.
right, okay.
And it happens to be about zero right now, but
thank you, Jay. Does that answer your question, Mr. Wheel? Okay.
And I think it's going to play into, so yeah, it'll play into our next agenda item a little bit as well. So if there's no further comment.
I move to approve Council Bill 7, Series 2023 as amended, a bill for an ordinance at the, yeah, whatever it said, I move that.
Sorry about that.
A bill for an ordinance of the City of Cherry Hills Village, amending Chapter 4, Article 1 concerning the city's capital funding on first reading. Capital fund on first reading.
Thought you had that memorized there.
We have a motion and a second. All in favor?
Aye.
Roll call.
Roll call.
Oh, roll call. You're right. I'm sorry. You even wrote it there. And
Counselor Eber?
Aye.
Counselor Holland?
Aye.
Counselor Wheel?
Aye.
Counselor Sheldon?
aye.
Counselor McGuire?
Aye.
Okay, and next, moving now to the Resolution 35, Series 2023, adopting a capital improvement program policy, and that's also Director Furman.
Thank you, Mayor. We do have a consideration to adopt this financial policy, the capital improvement program policy. This policy accomplishes what I consider to be four main objectives. It provides the guiding principles in developing the annual capital improvement program by protecting and developing the city's infrastructure, facilities, and other capital assets. And it also defines capital assets that may be part of the capital improvement program, which includes parks, trails, infrastructure, equipment, vehicles, and other assets. It also identifies capital planning objectives such as capital needs and replacement cycles. These objectives also are based on prioritizing projects such as health and safety, asset preservation, funding availability, whether or not the city could partner with other entities and other funding sources that we have available. The policy also stipulates that the annual capital improvement program would be submitted to the council at or beginning with the proposed budget. So you will see tonight in your 2024 proposed budget, you do have a draft capital improvement program. So that would be the new practice according to this policy. Again, we did get some comments from Mr. Holland, so thank you for sending us some suggestions. We do have a proposed change in the purpose from the word grow to change that to the word develop. So a little bit of change in semantics there. We agree with that suggestion. I think that's great if council wants to support that. And then in number 2, we've got it up here on the screen. It's the definition of budget that would just clarify that amount of funds that can be spent during the relevant fiscal year. And then lastly, in section 3, program development, actually section 6, Mr. Holland had suggested that the long-range financial plan also be prepared and reported along with the capital improvement program each year with the proposed budget. And as all of those plans are interrelated, we thought that would be a good suggestion as well and good information for council to have when they're considering the annual budget. So those are the recommended changes, and staff does recommend the policy with those recommended changes. I can answer any questions if you have any.
Okay. On looking at the capital improvement program policy on page 2, capital improvement program definition is a multi-year financial plan containing proposed construction of infrastructure, blah, 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 as well as other non-infrastructure. I think that should say as well as acquisition of other non-infrastructure capital assets, right? You're not constructing other non-infrastructure. You're acquiring those. Is that right? Construction of infrastructure as well as acquisition of non-infrastructure. Is that right?
I think that clarifies it. Yeah, yes, it would be done by acquisition.
Okay. And I'm going to take that as a compliment.
It was meant as a compliment.
I'm not sure it was intended that way. Okay, and then on page 3 of 4, capital planning objectives, that second sentence, maybe I'm not reading it right, but it seems like an incomplete sentence. A sound CIP that clearly identifies needs, options, and produces expenditure impacts as necessary to address current and long-term needs of the city. What?
Yeah, you're right.
Is something or?
Is necessary. There might be a typo there. But
okay.
Impacts is necessary.
Okay, and produces operating expenditure impacts is necessary to adequately address current.
Okay.
So
is necessary instead of as necessary. Okay. And then in the next paragraph, my comment is I think this sentence, the second sentence should end with asset life cycle rather than capital needs. We talk about asset life cycle. The city will utilize the adopted plan as the master plan to identify capital needs. Or, I mean, at the beginning of the sentence, you're talking about capital. Well, maybe that works out okay. I'll withdraw that because I don't understand what I was saying.
I'm just glad you're reading it so carefully, so thank
Yeah.
you.
It's horrifying. Okay, so then on page 4, program development and reporting, and Earl, maybe you'll have a comment on this. The estimated costs for each capital project shall include inflationary projections and funding sources. So annually, prepare this. This is going to show the costs over some time frame, right? Like over 10 years or over?
Right now, we're doing it over 10 years. Yes.
Over 10 years?
That's really up to council to see what duration they'd like to see there. But right now, we do have in the CIP.
So it'll show each
inflationary.
year for a particular project. Will it show, you know, the new city hall? It'll show in 2023 it's going to be this much, and then in 2024 it's going to be this. It'll show it on a project by project basis.
That's right.
Okay.
That's right. And we do include estimated inflation.
But I can read the words. Don't show me numbers. I need words. That's all. That's all I had on that. Thank you.
Yep.
And I have one comment about the Exhibit B to this policy. And I'm not sure if now's the right time to talk about the CIP budget itself. I guess that's a question.
I would recommend we hold off on the CIP budget till next session.
This is just as an
We have a full
example of what it
study
would look
session.
like.
Very good, then I'm gonna bite my tongue. I got a lot of questions.
So I have a big picture. Just want to make sure that I understand this. One way to do capital projections and budgeting would be to develop a 10-year capital plan and then to be budgeting. This was kind of where Randy was at with this commingling of funds thought, right? So you develop the whole plan. Here's how much money we're going to need over the next 10 years. And so we're going to divide that, you know, simplistically speaking, we're going to divide that and we're going to budget that much every year and we're going to kind of put it in that pot so that we know that money will be there 10 years down the road and to kind of equalize the impact so that, you know, in big capital years, there's money there. That's one way to do it. But that's not the way we're going to do it, because if we did it that way, then we would run into Randy's commingling of funds issue. So instead, we're going to transfer each year to the capital fund, and that. So I guess my question is, then how are we making sure that we're saving our pennies so that, you know, when we get to a year where there's a huge capital hit potentially, that we're prepared for that?
And I'll give the answer that I've
Yes.
given many, many times, which is to go, this council, the more important document is the long-range financial plan. It is not the budget. Not that the budget isn't important, ladies and gentlemen, but the long-range financial plan. And you're at that, which again, and the other thing that I've mentioned to Doug and Jim is that I do still think at the end of the day, at some point, we're going to get into a reserve discussion, reserve policy discussion.
Yes.
And those are not anywhere near as important as our own metrics, which are derived from that long-range financial plan, which goes out even further in a period of time. That's what we'll look at to sit back and go, hey, are we having issues? This council, that was the one thing that I didn't get done my last time on council, and this council still hasn't dealt with that. And I really think that that's an important thing, and I hope that that comes up when we talk about the reserve policy, because again, those are so short-term, and there are other metrics to be utilized that look way further out in time that will tell us with ample time as to whether or not we have issues or not. But to your specific question, that is exactly what you're doing, is you're looking at that long-range financial plan, and there are no shackles on council other than to sit there and look at it and go, hey, I know it looks like we got a lot of dough sitting right here, but look at all of these things coming out in time, so we really don't at the end of the day. And you run that out and you look at it, and that's how you know. And I actually feel much more comfortable with that than transferring these dollars in, because it reduces flexibility. But that's the trader in me. Traders are always looking for maximum optionality, And they got to be responsible and with risk analysis, but that's kind of where I come from, so.
Well, I guess I'm wondering if at any point, though, is there, so the problem is that we look at our budget, which is 1 year, and I hear you about the long-range financial plan, and I guess that's my concern, is that we look at our budget and we think, okay, we're taking in this much money, and that means we can spend this much money, and nowhere in our budget to date, because we've always had these huge surpluses, right? But you can't count on that. But nowhere in our budget is there sort of a line item for, and we need to be saving this for this purpose. And we haven't had to do that.
Katie, I think that's a really important issue. And I think it will come up, but I don't think it's part of this policy. This policy simply says we are going to plan, we are going to budget or create a forecast.
Well, and the only reason I bring it up is,
I think that's something we will be discussing.
I know we just already approved our capital fund policy, but the reason I brought that up is because that's how that's related in my mind.
It is.
That,
but that's the discussion we have at the end of the year when we have, so here's all this money and.
Well, but I guess that's my point is that we've been in that position every year since I've been on council. I have no reason to believe we won't continue to be in that position. But, there is a chance that you don't have any excess at the end, and then you don't have anything to put towards it. But
I agree.
And you can address that with the committed fund balance, which council can change every single year. You can raise it, you can lower it, you can cancel it.
Okay.
And again, and I just noticed that it is in here, so that's great. The point is we're going to be looking at the budget, which is what we have to approve and allocate. But we shouldn't do that without looking at that long-range financial plan. Absolutely. You always look at it and you sit there and go, oh, okay, so we're going to do $500,000 for this. That seems to make sense looking at it, but how does that look in terms of what it's doing to us from a long-range financial projection? Right. That's what we always have to do. And it's in there. Great job. So.
All right, any other questions about this? All right.
I move to approve Resolution 35, Series 2023, adopting a capital improvement program policy with the recommended changes.
Second.
All in favor? This is a voice vote.
Well, and with the recommended changes and the amendments that you made.
And the amendments that I made. Yes, those are recommended changes.
So moved again.
All in favor?
Aye. Aye.
Any opposed? Okay. Moving on to the tree preservation and replacement discussion, Director Workman.
Okay, good. Good evening, Mayor Brown, members of City Council. The information related to this topic that's both in your packet and presented here this evening is intended to facilitate a discussion, a conversation related to the current tree mitigation requirements and some new language that's intended to strengthen the tree mitigation requirements, which was the desire of council at the end of last year. At the time, staff heard from council that there may be interest in expanding the applicability of tree mitigation requirements, and that there was concern with the removal of large trees in the community with no mitigation requirement, i.e. outside of a formal building permit process. I want to be clear that the language for discussion tonight is not proposed for adoption. In fact, should council decide that this language strengthens the tree mitigation requirements to the satisfaction of council, there are some specific legal areas that will need further analysis. And to prep council for this conversation, I will not go through every change that is shown in your packet, but there are 5 areas that I would like to highlight for discussion this evening, mostly related to change to the applicability of wind tree mitigations required, new proposed language or a new concept called a heritage tree provision, expansion of the exemption list for trees that would need to be mitigated, new language related to stump removal, and then a new diversification requirement. So again, I'm not going to go through each one of the proposed amendments, But the first amendment that I would like to talk about is related to the applicability of tree mitigation. Right now, the code says that you have to mitigate trees in one of two scenarios: with the development of a new single-family home, or with the expansion of a new home, the expansion of an existing home by 50% or more. And that also applies to any 12 months preceding the date upon which the building permit for the application was approved. So this proposed language would remove the requirement or the limitation on the mitigation that tree mitigation would only apply to what we consider a major addition, those additions that are 50% or more of the existing structure. So in this case, if council desires to make this change, tree mitigation would be required for any addition to a home regardless of size.
If they cut down a tree as a
Correct.
result.
That's
yes.
correct, yes. Important clarification there. The second item is a new concept that's out there, really trying to address what staff heard in terms of council's concern for removing large trees that are not associated with some type of a building permit application. And this would apply to trees that are 20 caliper inches or more in diameter. That number was taken because of the tree mitigation requirements later in this chapter, right? It's broken out into 3 separate sections, and the cutoff is if you're 20 or more, then the most, restrictive mitigation requirements apply, and so that's where that number 20 came from. I do have a couple of photos here on the next slide that I'll show you, some trees that do meet that caliper. But basically, it would say that folks in the village would not be able to remove those heritage trees on their private property without getting approval ahead of time. And
Regardless of where they are on your property.
Regardless of where they are on the property, regardless if you are in process with a building permit or not. And really, the approval would be based on the fact that there's some threat based on the tree to the health, safety, or welfare, or that tree is so diseased and dying that it can't be reasonably saved. And it would also, again, and this is something we're certainly looking for council discussion related to, is require some notification to the adjacent property owners so that they know and it's not, they wake up one morning and all of a sudden the tree's gone. This concept was brought about in order to try and address the concerns we heard from council related to folks cutting down large trees on their property that, again, were outside of some process that would require some mitigation.
Are we discussing this now?
Whenever you would like to,
You
ma'am.
want to go through the whole
Oh, go
thing
through the
and then
whole
come
thing. That's
back?
fine.
Yeah.
These were the pictures that I mentioned. You can see Jan, our building permit tech there for scale. This is the south side of the park here where the riding arena is. Those cottonwoods on the left-hand side, those are right at 20 caliper inches. And we also wanted to give you an image of what a pine tree would look like at 20 caliper inches. And so that gives you kind of a scope and scale of the size of tree we're talking about when we say a 20-inch diameter. Staff would propose as well creating some additional allowances for mitigation requirements. Essentially, these fall into 2 separate categories. The first one is that the tree that's being removed is some type of noxious or invasive species. The second would be, again, it would be related to some type of health or safety concern, right? If it's in a sight distance triangle that's blocking the visibility for traffic, if it's diseased or dying, or if it's interfering with some utility service.
What is sight distance triangle?
Good question. So at certain intersections, the code says that you go a certain distance from basically the edge of the street on either side. Let's just say for purposes of discussion, to the east and to the south. You go 50 feet in either direction and you draw that triangle. There are certain limitations on what can be in that triangle in order to ensure that drivers can see around the corner.
Okay.
This concept is intended to get at what I think we all can remember as the Quincy and Franklin property over here when they cut down their trees and the stumps were there. and some of them are still there. This would put a provision in code that says that if you are removing a tree, that you do have to ground that stump down so that it's not a visual eyesore. And you'd be required to do that within 30 days of the tree's removal. And I hope you noticed on the previous slide and this slide, these are the two concepts that would need the most additional legal review, just to ensure their legality. And then another amendment for discussion. Again, this is a new concept, but it's widely practiced across communities, particularly here in the Front Range, where if you're required to mitigate trees, then you also must have a species diversity within that replacement, so that if one species becomes susceptible to some type of insect or disease or something like that, you don't have a massive loss of your tree canopy. So I know that was quick and fast, but again, the intent of these amendments is to get at the issues that we heard from council at the end of last year. We did get direction to strengthen this, and these were our attempts to address widening the times where it applies and address the issue of cutting down those large trees outside of some process that would require mitigation. With that, I'd certainly be happy to answer any questions.
My first question is, what is the enforcement mechanism? So someone goes and removes a heritage tree somewhere in their yard without complying with the notice and permit requirements, and they don't, and then they don't replace it. Well, how does the city enforce this?
So within Chapter 16 of the Municipal Code, within the zoning ordinance, we do have a whole chapter on enforcement, and I'm not sure what all the details are on that, but if it were taken down, then it would be subject to those enforcement provisions.
Council, do you have any idea what those are off the top of your head?
That's my recollection.
So you get fined?
Yeah, I also haven't had to look at it too often, but I believe it is a citation.
That's my recollection.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Thank you for everyone's reminder.
I think we ought to look into that. And what, you like continually cite them until they, that was the first question that came up to my mind.
I would ask if there are suggestions from council, we would be open to those as well. Again, it would needs to go through a legal vetting process, but we would be open to that.
Yeah, yes, I didn't think of a solution, I just had the question, but I will ponder on that. On page 3 of 5, and this is the heritage tree section, it seems very broad. So I have a heritage tree in my backyard. I'm guessing it probably is, it's a big tree. It's not really, it's not around the boundaries at all, and my neighbors can probably see it, but I guess I have two questions. One, I'm not sure I shouldn't be able to cut that tree down. It's in the middle of my yard. But I'll leave that because I'm sure a lot of people will have a lot of thoughts on that. But my second question is, if I'm only allowed to take the heritage tree down to ensure the health, safety, or well-being of the property, or it's diseased or dying, and I've already established that to you, why do I have to get the neighbor's consent?
You would not need to get the neighbor's consent. You would just need to notify them.
What's the point of notifying them?
It was to address a council concern that neighbors were seeing these trees come down on these properties that they've lived next to for 30 years. And this would at least give the neighbor an opportunity to know that it was coming.
Okay.
And that you've gone through the process.
As long as it's clear, it doesn't give the neighbors
a say.
A say in whether that comes down.
Well, and that's the thing is the notification, is it before the city approves it or after?
I believe it says 15 days prior to the removal.
It's after it's been approved, but before it can be removed, and it's
Which makes
2
no
weeks.
sense.
And basically,
It says prior to the removal of a heritage
City's already
tree.
approved it.
well, as Paul just said,
It's just
so
so
that
it's more of a heads up.
Limit the
Phone calls that.
ire, right?
That's right.
To keep people informed.
And all adjacent property owners, our yard backs up to Englewood. I'm assuming I only have to give it to the Cherry Hills residents that are adjacent to me and not to the people in Englewood behind me.
We could discuss that. My default answer would be
You don't
like
want
for a
phone
public
calls.
They're
hearing.
across, I mean,
For a
and
public
maybe,
hearing, we say you have to notify everybody within 1,500 feet. It doesn't matter what jurisdiction they live in.
Okay.
Now,
they are across
again,
the street, so I don't know.
again, these are concepts and language for discussion. So
No, that's why. I have to say, my feeling is that is overly broad. That's my perspective without hearing anybody else's feeling about it. Oh, yeah.
Turn your mic on. Yep.
You said that you objected to, maybe at a high level, object to the city saying you can't cut a tree down in your own backyard.
Yes, okay, let me rephrase it. I think we're overstepping there. That I certainly understand if it's on the perimeter of your yard, that maybe there's an argument for that, because that certainly affects the sightlines of the people around you. But if it's inside your yard, I question whether we need to go that far. And, I want to be sensitive to the rights of the trees, but gosh, it's my piece of property, and I think I ought to be able to take down a tree that
and I do think that there is some connection, right? Because we do regulate the mitigation for those trees that are within the setback. Again, it was intentionally written broadly based on that Quincy and Franklin property,
Yeah.
where some of those trees were within the building envelope, and there was still some angst over the removal. So that's just some background thought process how we got there.
And I'm curious to hear everybody else's.
Yeah, there's no good answer, right? I mean, you get a few bad apples, I guess pun intended. You get a few bad apples and they're going to spoil the party for everybody here. We're now having to put some new policies in place that might be a little overreaching because we've been burned. And I don't know if that's the right thing to do or not, but my few comments about this right now are also regarding the heritage trees. First, I wonder how we're going to get out to our residents. How is your next door neighbor going to know that they have to come in and apply for a heritage tree permit to take down a 20-inch or greater caliper tree? I don't know what that looks like, but we're going to have to figure out how to let the community know that they can't do that. And without some kind of huge, broad outreach that we're going to go do, I don't see it happening, frankly. And maybe it's letting our vendors know. We've done that before on some of these policy changes we've made. You reach out to Save a Tree and to, I was going to say Swingle, but that is Save a Tree. Whoever's out there, let them all know. And then I just get hung up a little bit on some of this, the aspen trees. There are aspen trees that people have planted in our city, and they're dying, and they're at their end of their useful life. Our homeowners may think that they're at the end of their useful life, but the city may not. And I don't know if that's something that we want to get into. And if you go out as director and you disagree, is there a arbiter? Maybe it's an arborist is the arbiter that we end up engaging or something like that. But there's just some kind of procedural problems that I could foresee in the future kind of coming out of this.
Yeah, and believe me, I don't want to be in that position.
I'm sure you don't.
Yeah.
Again, I think that echoes some of the conversation we had in the original study session for this is what is that balance of private property rights versus community character? And so we intentionally said, okay, here's what we heard, here's some options.
Yeah, those are my comments. I'd like to hear the rest as well.
I've got a number of questions and comments. We just sort of touched on one right up front. I'm going to be my usual self and give Kathy more work. And she looks up and goes, not more. I have a question about the fundamental legality of private property, trees being private property, and our authority to do this. To me, that's an executive session. I don't need you to answer it right now, but I think it's a huge question. We have people in this community, and let me start by saying, I'm a lover of the fact that we are part of Tree City. I'm a lover for what trees do. I don't know if I go so far as saying the rights of the trees, as Tori Leviton has talked to us about in the past, but I have some huge questions or need of clarity for our legal authority to be working on somebody's trees. I know that Denver has a heritage tree program and ordinance, and other places do, but I don't know what the requirements are or how it comes about. And I think there's a huge, no matter how much people want to preserve trees, I can tell you that in my neighborhood, it was after the one that raised up all the concern on Franklin, sorry. But, you know, a house in my neighborhood, they were getting ready to sell it, and they had 3, 75-foot pine trees that had grown probably from something being very small to something that was huge. And they basically covered the entire front of the house, and one day they were gone. And the next day the house was on the market, and it had great street appeal because you could see this house. And, you know, to the comment of how are we going to get out and outreach to all these people to tell them, you know, I think that's, you know, robbing a chainsaw doesn't get notified any more than Swingle does. So I think there's a whole bunch of questions, but the first and foremost one that I have is the legal authority and the bounds of our authority, so that when we get asked by our fellow citizens about why their private property tree, that we have the authority to tell them they can't take it down unless blah, blah, blah. That needs to be made really clear to everybody. The other parts about it is, you know, sort of the operative piece of it is, you know, how do you avoid intentional efforts to cause disease to a tree or kill it so that it then meets one of the exemption criteria? If I just don't water my huge pine trees, they're going to dry up and die. And guess what? Then I can cut it down. Or what if I poison it? Or, you know, the idea of a tree program, I get into the mechanism and the enforcement of some of these things, and it becomes a real nightmare. And I mentioned those couple things, but, you know, the administrative difficulties of enforcing it, of getting out there before somebody cuts it down, Dan already mentioned. You know, I think there's a piece in there that requires us to say that a tree is replaced for something that has to live for, is it 3 years?
That's a relocation requirement.
A relocation requirement is that it has to, you know, is a city clerk going to be watching number 4, you know, street to make sure that that tree is still alive in 3 years? You know, what's that? Well, but I'm talking about the practicality, and no matter how much we want to preserve trees. I mean, when I was on PTRC, we had a lot of time that we spent with people coming in and talking to PTRC, which has no authority on private lands, about the importance of what happened on Franklin being so devastating that the city has to do something about it. We shoved them all over and said, go talk to council, and that's what resulted in the discussions that
exactly
council
right.
had. Because it was a waste of energy for PTRC to be doing that. But, you know, I do think the longevity question is, you know, just an administrative nightmare. And then the question is, you know, how to make sure something's replaced. And then I guess my final question would be, on the practical side, is why is it that we have said that a 20 can be replaced by a 10 if our idea is to really want big trees, and in a world where big trees are honored, you know, that maybe it should be something totaling 20, if not another 20. But why is it that we're automatically giving people breaks on, you know, if it's a 10-inch tree, I think it was, you had to replace it with something totaling 5 inches.
Yeah.
Well, no, I understand all that, but I'm just talking, you know, this goes again to the point that no matter how much we want to be in this sphere, I want to make sure we're legally able and practically able to do something if we're going to enter it. Because I'll channel my best Earl and say, if you're going to have a regulation, you need to be able to enforce it. And this one sounds like a nightmare on trying to enforce, no matter how much we want to be able to enforce it.
Earl?
Yeah, and I agree. Obviously, you know, obviously, we need to have a before we move forward. But I did a little preliminary research, and the issue is that municipalities, I don't know about Colorado, but municipalities all across the country do have tree preservation ordinances. And the thing is as long as there's a valid environmental or community reason associated that is balances and the property rights, these things exist. And so my sense is from a federal perspective, I think that there's some basis we can do it. I don't know about Colorado, but I'm confident that there is. And the reasons for them, and people have been to various communities and whatever. I had the good fortune to live in Charlotte, North Carolina for 7 years. And if anybody's ever traveled through the Myers Park or Eastover neighborhoods, you know why those ordinances exist. I've never seen anything quite like it in my life, and no one's cutting down those trees. And they're all over it, because you can't. But I agree, we need learned counsel to tell us what we can and can't do. And I think, and again, your questions go to, I mean, it's, why are we saying this? Why are we saying that? That's the whole point of this, right? Is do we want to protect our trees, and to what level and to what extent? That's why all these questions are great. I mean, and we'll figure it out. And there are going to be some, which is, well, the reason this versus that is because that's what council has determined that we want to protect, based on our master plan input and what have you. And it ain't going to be any more than that. And somebody else can poke an argument through it. I will say the other thing when I was just doing a little bit, and you can, a heritage tree, you can do it by, but most of the things that I saw in heritage trees they're actually historic trees. I mean, it's like that one down in, what was the one that burned, and they survived. I mean, there's historic significance, but you can do it based on other, but typically that's what it means. So we have to be cautious a little bit about that. The enforcement aspect of it, and obviously if we did something, I mean, we'd have to get out there and do it, but are our current regulations enforced? And how do we know? Which gets a little bit usual. I mean, as an example, I know of a massive tree, massive. I think my personal view is it's the largest cottonwood in Cherry Hills, between the property line and the setback. And it was removed, and I'm wondering if a permit or an authorization was ever gotten for that. And I'm not going to say who would, what, but I'm just curious, do people come and say, hey, I want to take this tree out of my yard?
So let me start with answering that question first, and then I'll answer your first question second. Does that sound fair?
Sure.
So we occasionally do get calls that say, hey, I'm a landscape architect or whatever, and I'm working on this project and we're going to take down some trees. Do I need your permission to do that? Which leads me to the answer for the first question, which is, again, under the current requirements, tree mitigation is required in two scenarios: construction of a new home or a major addition, 50% or more of the existing square footage. So the answer to the question, do I need a permit, is, well, I don't know. Are you going to be constructing a new home or doing a major addition? Or if you're doing either of those in 12 months. If the answer to either of those is no, then you do not need anything from the city currently to remove trees from your property. And that was an issue that was raised previously with council, that there are significant trees out there that are being removed and not being mitigated.
Gotcha. Okay. Yep.
And then I also want to just real quick to Councilor Eber's question. Yes, and this was a conversation we had with council last year. Prior to the amendments last year, there was actually a limitation on the size of tree that you could use for mitigation. You could not plant larger than a 2.5 caliper tree. And the remaining members of council will remember
Change that.
that we did change that. So now if you want to replace a 20-inch tree with a 20-inch tree, you can.
I'm glad that you can. I just think that most property owners won't. And so the question is, if it's a 20-inch, do you want a total of 20 versus? That's what it says. No. If you can replace it, if you take down a 20-inch tree, it has to be replaced with a combination.
We had that conversation, and the reason we didn't do a total of 20 inches is because trees grow, right? I mean, you can't really feasibly buy a 20 caliper tree. I mean, right? And depending on where you're installing it, so we didn't want to get to the situation where we have required people to overplant. Right? I mean, that's just dumb. So the idea is that they grow, and yes, you're set back by a few years, but you're replacing it, and it will eventually get there, in theory.
But, okay, on our property, we had 2 very tall, beautiful pine trees that the person who built our house planted when they built the house. They are not historic, but they were 30 years old probably, and as tall as the house. The problem was they were planted too close to the house, so I would qualify under the welfare of the house. We were very concerned about one tipping over, the roots. We took them out. Didn't occur to me to call the city and say, can I take them out? And glad to know that I didn't need to. But under this, I would have to replace those trees.
And you would have had to have gotten a permit.
And I would have had to gotten permission. Well, I would have gotten the permission.
You would have gotten it, but
Yeah.
you would have had to go through that
But
process.
it's like, it's not that these trees are particularly significant in any way, other than they were tall. And frankly, had they not been so close to the house, we would have left them. But that, to me, the balance of the private rights of the.
Well, and that actually brings up another really interesting concept. If the tree is truly dead or dying, should I have to replace it with 10 inches of new trees?
Let's finish
If I
out
buy a
our,
house
Yeah, I
that's got
haven't-
a dead,
haven't-
24-inch
Not the
dead
brand new
cottonwood or pine tree or whatever,
Starting, because I haven't
do I
finished.
need to
yeah, let's
replace
finish
it?
out our
All right.
comments. Yeah, Earl still has his comments.
And there's some that, and this is always, as I always say, every time we go through an ordinance, you find stuff, this is past stuff, but I'm like, and I did want to come back to a comment that they made. My fellow council members thought it made sense that it's just you're advising your neighbors. I don't think that makes sense. The whole point of advising a neighbor is if they want to do something at the end of the day to stop you, so you want to do that before the city's approved it. Otherwise, I mean, I don't care if they're good neighbors or not. I mean, we shouldn't be in that business.
Well,
The
it's no
issue
different
is-
than a building permit, is it? I mean, you post your building permit saying you have permission to do this. I think that's all it is.
No, you actually, you've got to
Send a
go,
letter.
you've got to go to your neighbors. Our thing requires you go to your neighbors and say, this is what I'm going to do before they get the building permit.
The current language, you are correct.
Right, I mean, that's what the current language says, which then gives somebody an opportunity to go, not that it's going to have an impact, but it might. Anyway, that's just my view. The other thing is, the current thing say trees that have been or will be removed must be replaced, but it doesn't say where replaced. I mean, and is that, I mean, you
That was
pull-
intentional. You can put them wherever you want. You can't be required to put them in the same spot. I mean, that might be why you were moving it in the first
Yeah,
place.
I guess maybe, yeah.
So,
And then the other thing that I just wanted to note was, 2 things. Table 16.4230B talks about tree replacement species, but it's actually not talking about the species, it's talking about the variety. You can have 2 different species, 3 different species, 4 different species. That's the variety, the number of them, not the actual species, right? I mean, well, I don't think that that's an appropriate equation.
so the title of the table should say tree replacement varieties.
Yeah, or I mean, just, I mean, but species, when I think of a species, I'm thinking of an elm, I'm thinking of an oak, I'm thinking, here's what you can do.
Right.
I mean, right?
That's what it's intended to say, but if we need to wordsmith it, we can.
Well, yeah, just because, again, when you see it, you pass it on. And maybe this is
says you need-
what
if it's
Rob
3
was getting
trees, you
to,
need
but,
3
it
different
talks
types of
about,
trees.
in F down there, the removal of the
That's what I
established
read.
tree is beyond the reasonable control of the applicant. What does that mean?
Excel coming and cutting down my pine tree.
Okay.
A winter storm takes a tree down, that kind of stuff.
Okay.
Force majeure.
Okay, that's,
Act of God.
right. And then the last thing is, and I suspect that this probably is in the eyes of council, which takes into account the master plan, but when they talk about the requested waiver, the undesirable change in the character of the neighborhood, in the eyes of who? And I guess that's in the eyes of council? the undesirable change of the character of the neighborhood in the eyes of who?
So that would be, the way it is now, right, because this is existing language, the way
Right.
that's defined now is ultimately it's the director, it's me.
You.
We're going to write that in Paul Workman's opinion,
Regardless,
regardless of whether he still works here or not.
rest of his life.
Okay, anyway, those were my comments and/or questions.
Randy?
Yeah, no, same. I had a few minor language things, but I think I am stuck on the whole issue of, is it legal or not? You know, I don't want to echo comments that have been, I don't want to pass a law that's a bluff, you know? And if this is, and I don't want to be a Supreme Court case either over this.
We don't either.
You know, the time and expense and all the rest of it. I think trees are important. And I also, I've sort of, in the soul searching department, you know, driving down Quincy is one of my frequent paths, you know, and so I was incensed by the mowing of the trees and the leaving of the stumps, and it was kind of an emotional reaction as a resident. But I think it really is an exception, and I ask myself, am I overreacting? You know, so how many times has that happened in the 70-some years of our existence? So it's that kind of lessens the importance, and the other side of it is if it's sort of skating on the edge of legality, I don't really want to take the risk of, you know, for one lot, legislating a bunch of stuff that could get us into some serious problems. So that's kind of where I'm at.
So I agree with a lot of what has been said. I will add just a few things. A few thoughts came to my mind, and one, it's halfway addressed by that section F that Earl just mentioned. As a lot of you know, I was in a fight with Excel over a probably 60-foot pine tree. I don't know what caliper it is. I got to bet from those pictures it's at least 20. I would not have been able to come to you and get a permit, notify my neighbors for 15 days. This section says I don't have to replace it, but it doesn't say that I don't have to do all of this other stuff when it's outside of my control. And the same is true of an emergency situation. You know, a storm comes through and I've got half the tree leaning and falling over. Okay, I don't have to replace it, but according to this, I still have to go through this minimum 2-week process before I can have that tree removed. So I think if we decide to move forward with this, we've got to add some provisions in there for emergencies and other things. I got to tell you, I think the stump removal, I too am concerned about the legality. I think there probably is a balance. I think the stump removal is going too far, and I'll tell you, I'll give you an example. Right along Dahlia, there's this house that has you all know what I'm talking about. It has this just north of Quincy. It had this kind of concrete, almost like saguaro cactus tree looking sculpture. And they had a huge tree in their front yard that was dying. They didn't cut the tree down. They basically cut most of it down, and then they had an artist come out with a chainsaw and sculpt the remaining tree trunk and remaining branches to be similar to the sculpture in their backyard. A lot of the neighbors absolutely hated it, and they came to council to complain about it. But the bottom line is that was their choice in art, and it was completely within their right to do it. We don't generally regulate. We're not an HOA. We're a city. We don't tell you what color you can paint your house. We don't tell you what color your roof has to be. If you want stumps in your front yard, because for whatever reason, that's very subjective, and the fact that other people find them ugly and hard to look at, I just think we're starting to regulate aesthetics, and I think that's going way too far.
But you need to consider, I mean, and I'd sit back and go, hey, if you have a stump in your yard and you make a statue out of it, it's no longer a stump. It's a statue. It's a piece of art.
Well, I think the neighbors would.
No, I didn't say that people would like it. I mean, I'm just saying that,
Yes.
as opposed to a bunch of stumps, I mean, y'all.
I'll hollow them out and turn them into a planter. I mean, whatever, I may want to, I don't know.
Right.
I might want to put a dead driftwood tree in my landscaping, right? I mean, in my desert xeriscaped landscape, maybe I think. So I think that's starting to get into regulating aesthetics. So I feel like we're maybe overstepping there. And I guess the last thing I will say is that it is an extremely delicate balance. I like the ideas that have been proposed here. I have had conversations with a lot of the immediate neighbors on that property. And I think there's a compromise to be struck around maybe the heritage tree provision in some form, but sticking certainly within city rights of way or adjacent to the city right of way. And this is getting to your point, Susan, about, I know that the residents there would have loved for all of those trees to have been kept, but I think they're all pretty reasonable people, and I think they would have been amenable to some solution that protected the trees along the perimeter of the property. So within the setbacks, heritage trees within setbacks, maybe not right in the middle of the yard or right up against the house. I think that within setbacks might be focusing in on that very delicate balance.
Just so I understand, when you're talking about the setbacks, it's on not the buildable area, it's the perimeter around the buildable area?
Yes,
Yep.
setbacks kind of on all sides. Yep, so any heritage trees within the setback area.
Like Paul's written, basically.
Yeah, well, in this case, it's actually, you remove the setbacks. Right now, it's all the way, it's anywhere in the yard for the heritage trees.
For heritage trees, anywhere in the yard.
Yeah.
But, correct, but those that are associated with building permits are just within the setbacks.
Right. So I think maybe adding the setbacks into here would be fine. I hear you about the notification thing, but I'm okay with requiring notification. I would say immediately adjacent. And that would mean anybody across the street is not immediately, it's your immediate neighbor. So it's at most
Abutting.
4 people or something, right? I
Abutting.
mean, 5 or so. I don't think that's, and it's just as a way to try to keep the peace.
Is that our job?
No, it's the homeowner's job. That's why we're asking that they notify.
Paul, I appreciate that you put this together, and I think this is a really good discussion to have. And I hope you don't take all of these comments as any kind of criticism.
No.
At all, because I do think this is going to be a little bit of a drawn-out process, because we do have to think a lot about all of this. So I appreciate the work.
No, believe me, nothing is taken personally. This is intended to be this type of discussion, right? So that we make sure that we write code that's consistent with the policy that you all want. So this is exactly what I was hoping for.
So hopefully you have some direction. Does anybody have any other?
Just a real quick closing, and that is that I guess when we talk about the legal side and the legal opinion, it sounds to me like there are permissible heritage tree codes. I need to understand what makes them legal and if we're doing it based on something called heritage trees, what is the standard to be a heritage tree? Because it sounds like right now it's based strictly on size. I mean, Earl made a comment about some trees in where he used to live that might have seen the Declaration of Independence or a Civil War. That I can understand why they would be historically significant. I just want to make sure that a tree is deemed heritage so that it meets whatever the legal requirement of public health, safety, welfare that makes it okay for legislation or code that is not just based on the fact that it's big and old, because houses in the village used to be small, and as part of the evolution of the village, houses have changed, and it might just be considered that tree canopy is something that evolves the same way houses have evolved. I don't know the answer, but I'm just saying that just because something was, in Susan's case, planted with the building of the house, might not be the type of tree that we automatically want to keep. I cried when I saw the neighbors taking down 3 huge trees because I thought they had done a huge disservice to the neighborhood, and yet that's what happened. So it might just be part of the evolutionary process of the village. I don't know. I don't necessarily say I like it.
Fair enough. All right. We will move on to reports. I will start. I attended the Cherry Hills Land Preserve Barn Party on Friday night, and it was delightful. Quincy Farm looked beautiful. As you all know, Friday was a rainy day. I was very nervous for them. The weather did improve. They had some unexpected mud issues to contend with, but they did it beautifully. And the little twinkling lights, and it looked really beautiful. So kudos to staff. I know you all put a lot of effort into that property, and to the land preserve for pulling off and being flexible and responding so quickly. It was a great event. Looking forward to Dine for the Highline this Friday night. And if any of you, we still have one ticket that was given to the city as a partner that is available if there's anyone who's not already attending who would like to attend. And other than that, we had a meeting with our lobbyists about potential zoning reform, renewed efforts. And I think we're on top of things. Arapahoe County is organizing a bus tour for legislators. They have 2 different dates that they're looking at. And they would like elected officials on the bus. It's a pretty long commitment. So when I know for sure the dates and times, I'll let you know. But the idea is that they've identified, a tour of sites, both of existing projects, some completed projects, some apartments, some duplexes. And then I know on the west side, they also plan to do some stops that kind of show the gentrification that's going on in parts of Inglewood and what the unintended consequences of some of those provisions might be. I think it's a fabulous idea. Hopefully they'll get good participation from our legislators on that issue. And I will close it at that. And I'll start.
Well, in your meeting with the lobbyists, has there been starting to provide some input with regard to, are they getting anything about strategies, what might be coming up from the legislature, from Polis, whatever? Just from my own perspective, I'm going to be interested in just a regular update on that because I want to know what these guys are thinking and doing. And
well, I don't know. So I don't think they have any real specifics yet. But we're not waiting. CML's not waiting. We're not waiting to see the bill first this time. There are a few things that are generally expected. I think we know that it's not going to come back as one big package. There's a lot of talk that ADUs will be something that make a return. transit-oriented development is going to make a return, most likely in some form. I have not actually heard anybody say one way or another whether they think the middle housing duplexes and whether that'll, I haven't heard anybody say anything about that yet. It seems to be that the ADUs and the transit-oriented development are where we're getting the most traction. So that's about all we know right now. One interesting thing, actually, I'm realizing you probably don't know, is that if Megan McKillop was a lobbyist for CML, and she is leaving CML and is joining our lobbyist firm. So she's going to be a new partner. So we'll still be working with her. It'll be interesting to see who CML replaces her with, because we certainly need somebody working on that. But yeah, she was great to work with, and I'm excited that we'll get to continue to work with her on that issue. And it's nice to know that even if she's not part of CML, it sounds like she'll be still very actively engaged on that issue. So let's start on the inside this time. Randy.
Okay. Probably the big, DRCOG, we had a RTC meeting this morning, and there were some interesting things going on. The Front Range Passenger Rail, there's a special district that's been developed by the legislature, and they're celebrating a one-year anniversary. They have a plan, still fluid, but sort of Pueblo on up to Fort Collins, using freight tracks, their own rolling stock, and all of that is dependent on having a good enough story that this is really needed to develop a mill levy and fund themselves, pass it by the voters and fund themselves. So a lot has to happen right for this all to come to pass. And their time frame is actually out 2025 to go for a ballot initiative. Interesting, though, they're going out to far western part of the state and watch a hydrogen-powered locomotive being tested, which is something new to me. Let's see. The RTD folks, and that's independent, by the way. That Front Range Passenger Rail is not part of RTD. It's not part of CDOT. It's an entity unto itself. But they coordinate as well. So then RTD, they won't have data, but we should get something next month around the success of free fare for better air. They're rolling out the student no fare program, so that's kind of exciting. Let's see, their bond rating has moved up to AAA+, and they're proud of that. Okay, that's, and then the one that really made me happy, the Regional Air Quality Council. There's a guy named Mike Silverstein that runs that pretty nice guy. And I spent some time talking with him. They have, I was telling Jay, they have some pretty good funds and are making grants up to $100,000, so not trivial amount of money, for electrification of equipment. That's the group that proposed the regulations that has gone to the State Air Quality Committee, which basically says they don't want municipalities to be using gas-powered, this is small motor stuff, like weed whackers and blowers and things like that, but they want the states, the cities and counties to turn that over in a couple of years and cease the sale of that stuff about the same time. So, and then there's further regulation for the landscapers, but they've got some money, and, you know, I've heard other people other cities complaining about, oh, yeah, we can't do that in those timeframes and all the rest of it. My feeling is $100,000 grant, you know, we might be able to do some serious conversion in advance of all of these regulations that may not materialize, but may materialize, and sooner or later it's going to happen. So I think that's an exciting opportunity for us. And that's my report.
Let's hop over here. We're going to work inside out.
Thank you, Mayor. Just one report. In looking at the CIP budget, and I know we're going to talk about that in more detail on October 10th, but we have added in a whole bunch of things that we've been all talking about and prior councils have been talking about now for quite some time. A lot of them have gotten in the CIP, for many of them for next year, 2024 construction on some capital improvement stuff. I guess I'm hoping to give you guys a little advance notice right now that come October 10th, I'm going to be asking council and staff to consider adding another line item in the budget for a cell phone infrastructure program. Don't know what that number is today. Hope to have a number to propose by the 10th. It's going to be wrong, the number for sure. But we have to start somewhere, and I think it would be in our best interest if we start plugging in a number now. We have a big surplus, as we all know, and I'm not suggesting we go suck the surplus dry, but I do think it behooves us to put some target into our budget that we should start thinking about for this project. And I don't know what the number is yet. I'm hoping to been working offline with city staff over the last few weeks about this, and we're hoping for some really high-level analysis and numbers that would include not necessarily a backbone of fiber throughout the city, because that's not the scope that we have been, in my mind, that's not the scope we gave to our consultant, was a big fiber backbone. Like one of the original maps we saw, 25 miles of new fiber being laid. What I was more envisioning is a plan that had fiber running to a select number of future locations for antennas, maybe 9 antennas kind of scattered out in a grid of 2 rows that are 4 or 5 in each row, and having the fiber running to get to those antennas. So it's hopefully a budget that is what we need, but not anything more than what we need. But it's going to be hard to really pin that down now. But I just given you a little sneak peek that I'm going to be suggesting to everyone in this room that we do plug in a number for 2024. That's all.
Earl.
And just for the record, recall at the last meeting, I suggested 2.5 million and go down from there, and we don't need to consider anything more than that. And I got booed. Not booed, but shot down.
And I'm going to go ahead and say for the record that I am going to be pushing for a number bigger than that in the 2024 budget.
Well, then be prepared.
That was your heads up, Earl.
That's the heads up. The only thing I have, I as well attended the land preserve party at Quincy Farm. I thought it was extraordinary. It was extraordinary, the work that had been done there, how good the farm looked. In fact, I kept joking to people, to the land preserve people, this looks too good. You know, we're trying to get donations here. I mean, it was just fantastic. And putting that stone down in advance of the rain, that wasn't the reason it was put down, but that was terrific. And everybody, I think, had a great time, and just hats off to staff and to the land preserve for just really a terrific evening. And then just wanted to say thanks to Catherine and all those that worked on the compensation study. That's really, really important work. But in addition, it's important because we all just feel like we've got the best staff, in the metro area in Colorado, and they deserve to be compensated as such. So appreciate all of that work that was done on that at this point.
Susan.
I don't have much, but I did want, and I'm sure I do this not only on behalf of myself, but the whole council, to send our wishes for I'd say a speedy recovery to Officer Smith, but as speedy as it can be. And for those who don't know, who might be listening, one of the officers here had a motorcycle accident while on duty, training, and broke several bones, and is on his way, is home from the hospital. So the recovery process has started, but I just, please let him know that he is in our thoughts and prayers. And
Thank you.
that's all I have.
Rob?
I met last week, pulled Paul out of his COVID recovery, and we met with the folks in code enforcement, Lane and John, about the general approach to abatement of nuisances in the city, particularly from weeds and things like that. This followed my report last meeting and then a quick conversation that I had with Kathy about that. I did not want to play lawyer to them, so I said, talk to Kathy, and if you guys are ready to pull the trigger, she's ready to help you do abatement. The comment that I got that was interesting that I'll pass on was that I think John made the comment that in the many years that he'd been with the village, he really hasn't used the abatement process and really wanted sort of to know that he could and should and under what parameters. And I, of course, said, get counsel on those type of things. But I thought it was interesting that we do have a citizenry that is compliant enough that when you tell them what needs to be done, generally the citizenry responds and abates whatever it is that caused the problem to start with. Now, there certainly are some instances that doesn't happen, and my personal opinion expressed during that meeting was that when we do have those, let's not be shy about doing them quicker, especially for things like weeds, which in the course of one property in my neighborhood has not been mowed the entire summer, and we now have 8-foot-high weeds across the entire property. And things that need to be abated timely, the city should not be scared to do that. And Paul, I think you weighed into on the fact that it's there, it's in the code, it's a tool. We just got to be ready and willing to pull the trigger on some of these. So I thought it was a good meeting, and if it hasn't happened already, my sense was they're going to be talking to Kathy about stepping up and trying to address one in my neighborhood and then maybe one that Dan had mentioned a couple of meetings ago. I also got a chance to meet with Jay and Emily to go over the anticipated parks budget for next year, and for a rookie, I thought it went pretty well. They didn't tell me that I screwed up too badly, so I think everything that is anticipated, there are some big numbers in the parks budget, but I think they are numbers that were kind of coming due for things that we've been talking about for a long time, in particular the barn. We've sort of been waiting, putting money aside, and now it's time to finally do the capital improvement project. So even though it looks like big numbers, they're not unthoughtfully put into the budget for upcoming projects and capital needs. Sadly, I've also been notified of a couple, if not more, building permit violations where people are forgetting to get their building permit applications in. And I don't know if this is just sort of a rash that I've become aware of lately, or if this is something that Paul has to deal with all the time. But it's kind of gotten to the point where I want to make sure that this isn't something that we have to deal with too often. And in that vein, I guess I would, I know there's an enforcement provision within that, but sending out an inspector and going through the hassle of putting up a notice and stop work order, and a lot of people do that and then they say, oh, I didn't know, and they ask for forgiveness. well, it takes time, energy out of the city's ordinary duties, and I think that we need to consider strongly having at least a nuisance fine that will discourage the upfront violation instead of the no harm, no foul of asking for forgiveness and not having any incentive to get the permit up front. So, I hope it doesn't happen, that we need to do something like that, but I would encourage us to use that when necessary. Our neighbors to the west, in a couple of weeks, are going to go through a recall, and without getting involved in the specifics on some of their, I think it's mayor and a couple council members, we should be aware of what it is and the issues that are addressed in there, both from performance, but also from the idea of using recalls as a tool, and just be aware of it, I guess I would say. It is going on with our neighbors and largely centered around many of the issues that were addressed in Senate Bill 213 last session. Finally, I guess I would just comment that in lieu of our discussion about trees, it might be a ripe, open meeting, community forum topic to kind of get a flavor for what the community wants to do. That's it. Thanks. Shana Tova to everybody.
I did make one omission, so just so that at our last meeting, I kind of threw out whether people wanted council to take a stance or pass a resolution regarding Prop HH. Since that time, CML has actually come out in opposition to Prop HH. They have provided a sample resolution in opposition to Prop HH. I don't know if, at this point, we would only have the October 10th meeting. The election is in November. Is that something that you would want to see at the October 10th meeting? Or is it, do you not have I guess you could either not have a position on the issue, or you just don't feel that we have enough time to make an impact on that. So is it something you'd like to consider on October 10th or not?
I'm happy to consider that.
Okay. Yeah, general thumbs up. Okay. Can we pull that together by October 10th? Thank you. Okay, so then moving on to reports. I don't have my agenda. Who goes next? I'll turn it over to you, Jim, and you can.
Okay, I'll jump in. I've been gone for 3 years, and I'm back now for a couple months. But one thing that has changed is that we're missing two of our constituents that usually come to this meeting. And today I was fortunate enough to talk to Alice and had a great conversation with her and told her I missed her at our meetings. And I know Fred is not doing well, but at the same time, it was great to talk to Alice, and she sounds wonderful. And out there, I know you're watching, so I'll just give you a shout out. Second, we've already mentioned the study session is on October 10th. We've canceled the October 3rd meeting. That's for the public information. And we've realigned that with October 10th so that all of our council, I think all of them will be here for that meeting. And even though you got a budget tonight, there's still things that are in motion on that budget. And so there'll be some little changes here and there as we move forward. But obviously, we're looking at that October 10th meeting to get all of your input and then start to make some final decisions. The final budgets will be heard November 7th and then December 6th. So that should be on the agenda. Let's see. As far as, grants, I love using OPM, as I call it, other people's money. Of course, it has to fit in the right scale and what we're doing, but certainly we can look into all the grants that are associated with electrification, and there are some out there, and if they fit our needs, we'll jump on them. So, and I think with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jay. There is a young lady here, and maybe you want to, even though she's left for the night, but you can introduce her. if council hasn't already met her.
Yes, I think I mentioned a couple weeks ago that Jenny started with Public Works. It's been a week now? No, yeah, just about a week. So she's getting settled in. And if you haven't already stopped by to introduce yourself, she's at the front desk, so stop by. It's going to take a little time to get her up to speed, but she's doing great so far.
And that was her that was sitting in the back room?
Yes.
Okay. That answers that question, Dan.
And I'll turn it over to Kathy at this point.
Just one quick item. Council knows that the city officially responded to the Colorado Open Lands Impact Memo regarding the west area of Quincy Farm. And city staff is working with legal counsel to provide a follow-up communication to Open Lands along with a longer-term plan about activities on the property as a whole. So that's just an update is that we anticipate that to be pulled together within the next couple weeks. And so we'll keep you up to date.
For Finance and Administration, I'll just echo Jim's comments about the budget. 3 weeks will be coming up pretty quickly here, so thank you. We'll take any questions or comments ahead of time.
First, good evening, and I just want to thank you for all of you that shared your concern for Officer Smith. He, as mentioned, he does have a long road of recovery ahead of him, but he is starting that journey with a smile on his face and is in good spirits. Couldn't be more proud of how the department has rallied around him and members of city staff and council, and he's certainly recognized that. So thank you all for those of you that reached out and shared your positive vibes for Officer Smith. He was to be recognized yesterday amongst a small group. We did have a swearing in and promotional ceremony here in council chambers yesterday at 2:00. It's a little different because typically we recognize people a swearing in ceremony immediately upon their hire. This particular group was a little different. 2 of our officers were hired actually back in January. They were only with us for a few days for orientation, and then they went off to the police academy for 5 months. They graduated the first week of June and then immediately started field training, which is just now coming to conclusion. So we recognize them in a swearing in. Officer Smith, who was hired in May, would have been recognized in that swearing in, as was Officer Tony Garcia, who was promoted yesterday to the rank of sergeant. He brings a tremendous amount of experience with him, 32 years of prior law enforcement experience, 18 years as a sergeant in a variety of domains, and just his wisdom, his experience, and his energy is going to be well received within our organization. And then lastly, I've mentioned our Crime Watch platform. As you know, that is up and running. Tomorrow, you will see our first weekly police blotter that will be published. I was doing some edits on that this afternoon and then lost track of time, so I didn't get a chance to get that published, but it'll be published tomorrow. Just sort of just a summary of police activity, and we're going to do that each week, probably on Monday or Tuesday, although this week a bit late, but expect to see that moving forward. Happy to answer any questions if you have any.
Can you refresh my memory about the difference between theft and burglary?
I sure can. So to not overly complicate that, burglary is when one enters and remains in a structure, conveyance with the intent to commit another offense therein. So essentially without permission going into someone's residence or the curtilage thereof with the intent to commit some other crime while they're there. Typically that crime would be theft, right? So you break into a house, you steal stuff. So that's, and then theft is of course just the taking of the real property of another without consent and permission. So those are the differences between the two. I think as the two that most often get confused are robbery and burglary. Burglary is to property, to structure. Robbery is the crime against a person, which is the unlawful taking of property from another against their will using threat or coercement or or force. So
If it's a car, is that a burglary or is that just theft? Like if they break into
in Colorado, it's called a first-degree criminal trespass. So
That's
it's
right, okay.
essentially the same thing as in other states call it a car burglary.
Yeah.
But in Colorado, it's a criminal trespass. So entering that conveyance with the intent to commit another crime therein, absent a structure.
Okay. And I happened to notice that unfortunately our crashes are up pretty significantly. What are you going to do? All right.
I would just say, anybody else impressed with the definitions that he just rattled off there?
I knew she was going to ask to have cheat sheet.
One quick update from community development. Next week on Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, I will be attending the state APA conference in Colorado Springs, and I'm excited to get down there and hear the discussions related to the upcoming 213 discussion. So I will keep council updated on that. I have no further items.
No report. Thank you.
All right, and Counselor Sheldon has something.
I have one more quick thing, sorry. One thing I did talk to our city manager Thorson about recently, I think, was not that we don't have ways to spend our ARPA money already out there, but I noticed that we're all sitting here going like this to see Laura and going like this to see Chief Lyons, and I might throw out there that I think it would qualify as under the ARPA improvement dollars that we have if we wanted to do a retrofit of City Hall and extend these wings out. I was at one point thinking maybe we cut down the sections towards the very end caps, literally cut them down where Rob is sitting and not have that high level, but we built this high level for a purpose, I think. So maybe extending these wings out by basically 2 chairs of additional length would allow for Chief Lyons and Paul to basically be able to be sitting where Jay and Catherine are right now and having 2 more seats essentially to the south of Catherine. I know it's a little petty thing for us to be discussing, but really we all sit here every single time, whether it's us or planning commissioner or an HOA or whoever's sitting up here, they're going like this because they can't see anybody. It was a flawed design, and I just want to point out that I think we could use some of those funds, and it would be a relatively small amount of money in the grand scheme of things if we wanted to consider that.
Thank you, Councilmember Sheldon. We've already started looking into that. We haven't ignored your thoughts and ideas, and I know Jay's been contacting the previous builder of this dais and see if we can get some estimates and costs for that. But as soon as we get that, we'll bring it to council and see if we can add on to that.
And maybe just move it down, move it down rather than extend it so that there isn't a seat there that can be out of view, you know. Because if
yeah,
I think it's a great idea, but I've got a smile on my face because I'm sitting back and I'm going, oh, how times have changed. Hey, let's add a couple more so we can see our people as opposed to where they used to sit 4 years ago.
Yeah. Well, the good thing
folding
is
tables on either.
with boxes.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think that unless anyone has anything else, is there a motion to adjourn?
Move to adjourn.
Second.
All right. See you on October 10th.